All right, good morning. We're going to begin our panel discussion for this morning. First, I'd like to say that this program was provided through generous support from Florida Humanities. Today's presentation is Zora Neale Hurston through Space, Place, and Time. And we have with us Sidney Rose McCall, Dr. Christopher Peace, and Ray Chesney. We're going to let the panelists introduce themselves, then they're going to have an in-conversation between the three of them while we listen, and then we'll have a Q&A, all right? So welcome and thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I am Ray Chesney. I am a Zora Neale Hurston scholar, and I actually serve as Director of Programs for the Zora Neale Hurston Trust, which is the organization established and run by her familial heirs. Other than that, I talk about Zora every day, pretty much all day, even in my pajamas. And because I know so much about Zora, they call me the Zora Girl.
Good morning, everyone, those of you that are joining us online as well. My name is Sidney Rose McCall. I am a historian of environmental history who just has a deep love affair with Zora Neale Hurston. So even though I study environments, I like to look at how do Black people navigate and move in those spaces. And Zora Neale Hurston moved in a lot of spaces.
Hi, everybody. My name is Christopher Peace. I feel like I'm a budding Zora fan. I don't know if I can say I'm a Zora scholar, but I definitely have been reading her and engaging with her for a while now, ever since 10th grade, really. But yeah, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Georgia Tech, Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta, Georgia. I have my PhD in rhetoric and composition, so I'm really interested in how language works. And my personal studies are hoodoo and conjure and root work. So I'm interested in Zora's ethnographic novels and how she, goes into these communities and studies esoteric practices, basically. So nice to meet you all.
Awesome. So I'm going to start off with some trouble. I'm the troublemaker, guys. Do you want to? Yeah, I think we can. So one of the things that I like to do whenever I go somewhere and I'm talking about Zora is I actually like to invite her into the space with us. And so we're going to do that now. Are you doing it?
You can go to the next slide and it'll play in a second. We just have to be a little patient.
This song I got at Callahan, Florida, which is a railroad center in the northern part of Florida. I got this in 1935. I don't remember the man's name that sung it to me, but I got it at Callahan at the railroad camp.
What type of song is it?
This is not exactly a song, it's a chant for the men lining. You know, a rail weighs 900 pounds, and the men have to take these lining bars and get it in shape to spike it down. And while they're doing that, they have a chant that, and also some songs that they use the rhythm to wake it into place. And then the boys hollers bring up a hammer gang, and they start to spiking it down. And this is a chant for lining the rail. Mobile, in Alabama, Fort Myers, in Florida, let's shake it, let's break it, let's shake it, just bring up my hammer gang.
Now look, I'd like you to do that again, but this time, when they have what do they call the irons that they use for?
They call it a lining bar.
All right. The lining bar, when they work, don't you hear the clink of it?
They just say, ha, but you don't hear the lining bar because it's under the rail and they shove the rail with it.
Yeah.
But you can't hear it. But you hear that.
Hit against it?
No, it's under it. You see, it's just like on this. And it's a crowbar.
Because over in Mississippi, they showed me by hitting.
Yes.
Well, they said that the way they did it was several men taking a short hit.
Well, I've seen them put it between their legs this way and put it back. And they get this flange under the rail. And then they You know, like
and
that.
well, now what do they do? Are they pulling it?
Pull it backwards. They're moving it backwards.
In other words, they have it underneath, and they're
Yes.
using the leverage
That's right.
to go forward.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Would you say
And all the men, you know, because it's awful strained, and they.
about how many men are there on a bar?
Oh, sometimes it's about 7 or 8 on at one time.
Mm-hmm. Well, suppose you try it and you sing it over again.
All right. Mobile, on Alabama, Fort Myers, in Florida. Let's shake it. Let's break it. Let's shake it. Just have.
And you guys can probably go back to that first slide. So I get my troublemaking qualities from Zora because I do want to, if it's okay, I want to give some context to what's happening in this clip. Number one, being able to hear Zora's voice, her singing the song she captured in the field as a Black woman anthropologist starting in 1927. She traveled the very racist American South to prove that Black people, and not just Black people, but the folk, the people working in these backwoods camps, railroad camps, turpentine camps, sawmill camps, she is living among these people to say the way that you live, who you are, your cultural practices have value, and I'm gonna prove it. What's important about this is that in 1927, from that point on and that point before, anthropology as a field was not concerned with how Black individuals lived. At that time, they were called Native Americans, and that was all the rave, right? And so Zora was at Barnard. She was the first Black student at Barnard College, which was the all-white girl affiliate of Columbia, still right across the street today. And she was set to graduate in 1927, and she wrote an essay that included folkloric stories. And Franz Boas, who started the School of Anthropology at Columbia, got a hold of Zora's paper, and he's like, who wrote this? So here she is, a Southern Black woman in 1927, first Black student at Barnard, and across the street at Columbia, the father of American anthropology gets a hold of her paper. He sends for her, bring her over here, I'm gonna train her up. Zora says, all the things you're collecting from Native Americans, Black people got that too. And he was like, well, prove it. And she spent the rest of her life proving it. And so that song, along with others that exist in the archives at the Library of Congress, you can actually click a link and there's a cache of them. It's so many of them. And you can hear Zora performing the songs that she's collected in the field for predominantly white anthropologists at the Clara White Mission in Jacksonville. It's around 1940. But as you can hear, I love for this to be the first song, so thank you, Christopher, for that, because you can hear she's getting pushback from an audience member. And Zora was the leading Black woman anthropologist and leading Black anthropologist in her time. No one could collect folklore artifacts like Zora, right? And he's arguing with her. Well, in Mississippi, they showed me this, and you could hear her move from the mic and was like, I will stand up and demonstrate because I lived among them. I practiced, I worked, I contracted malaria and bed bugs. So I know, I didn't just go in as a social scientist with distance from my subjects. I was with them. And I practiced the songs, I practiced the work until they gave their approval and said, yep, you sound like us. So let's shake it. Y'all ready to shake it? Yes. All right, I have a question for you guys. When did you first encounter Zora? And is that when you first fell in love with her?
Well, I know for me, Zora, in some respects, was always kind of a part of my life. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a family of amazing Black women, whether they were play aunties, godmamas, my actual aunties, and my mother as well. And so many of their teachings were rooted in Black Southern traditions, Black eco-cultures. And one thing that I realized the first time I read Their Eyes Are Watching God as a freshman in college was that all of what Zora is talking about, I already knew. Everything that Zora was singing about, I had already heard sung in my own house, in my auntie's house. When she talked about recipes, I knew what food she was talking about. I could taste it on the back of my tongue. So that was something that I realized, that it was like meeting an auntie who you hadn't met before, but you already knew. And so for me, Zora has always been a part of me, even before I knew her name.
I love that. Christopher. Christopher's like, I gotta follow that up, right?
I'll just get used to that for this whole conversation. So for me, I met Zora in high school, and it was in 10th grade English, where my English teacher assigned an assignment where there was like multiple books to choose from, and I remember like Angela's Ashes and other books, and I chose Zora's because it was Black, and I just wanted to read something Black at the time, and I never had heard of her. But growing up in Jackson, Mississippi, technically I grew up in Clinton, Mississippi, which is right next to Jackson. I grew up in a strictly Pentecostal church, very much holiness, in a way. But my church was led by a woman pastor, so I was interested in like Black women and spirituality. And when I read Zora for the first time, even though this is the book that I brought with me from 10th grade that I still have, and I still have my notes in here. But when I read Zora for the first time, it really opened me up to, people are actually talking about Black spirituality and religion in a way that I had never experienced before. Because even though I grew up in a strictly Pentecostal church, I was still interested in like Harry Potter and magic and other things like that. And after reading Their Eyes Are Watching God, I was interested in Zora more, and I read The Sanctified Church, where I thought it would be about church for the most part, and it was in some places, but it was still like very much hoodoo and esoterica and things of that nature. So because of that 10th grade assignment, it opened me up to a world of imagination.
Oh, it's so funny. And I love that Their Eyes Are Watching God. Y'all were assigned the book and y'all actually read it, right?
Right.
So Zora must be a forgiving ancestor, because I was assigned Their Eyes Are Watching God in my 11th grade AP English class, but I grew up as a reluctant reader, and that was like my rebellion. My parents didn't play. I still had to get good grades, so it wasn't that I wasn't at the right reading level. It just was not my activity of choice. And so in 11th grade, I was assigned Their Eyes Are Watching God, and I did not read the book. I did not read the book. And I love telling the story, and it's funny because I come down here 2 to 3 times a year, and Zora, she takes me on adventures all the time. But it's so funny because in June, I was in Tampa, and I did a presentation for College Board's AP English teachers, like from around the nation on Zora. I was like, let's get this out the way, because I already know. And when I said I didn't read the book, they were like, and I was like, but I have since read every Zora book, and I don't know more about a single subject. And it was actually Zora, so she came to greet me at the door, but I did not open the door in 11th grade. But I started writing children's books in 2015 because I thought, I think other Black children from my hometown, Detroit, are rebelling against literacy just like I was, because their voices and their image, they don't matter, right? And as you look at diversity in publishing, even still today, there's such a disparity. And so I started writing children's books because I always loved to tell stories, and a little sassy, I was like, they keep telling me to read all these other people's books. How come no one wants to listen to my stories? So this is my inner child being like, I'm going to write stories for other children and let them tell their stories. Well, Michigan State got a hold of what I was doing. I started a literacy program. They would send their students down to run the program. And they actually ran it so well that I was able to go on maternity leave with my little son, who's right up here. He's 7 now. And he said, the professor said, my students love you, your students love you, come to campus and do a Black history presentation. And I said, on what? The person who most inspired your career as a writer. I didn't have anybody because I was a reluctant reader, but he said these magic words. He said, we will pay you an honorarium. I was like, I'm inspired, it's coming back to me, my memory is here. And so in 2017, as I was preparing for the 2018 presentation, I picked Langston Hughes, because I was like, I'm a new mom, I can brush up on some poetry, I'm a Black writer, Harlem Renaissance, it makes sense. I was bored out of my mind researching Langston. And I know it's Paul Laurence Dunbar who talks about the masks we wear, but Langston Hughes wore a lot of masks for different reasons. Well, as I'm researching him, Zora keeps popping up. And I'm like, wait a minute, this lady was raised in the first all-Black incorporated municipality in the history of the United States. She was an anthropologist, trained anthropologist in 1927. Her father was the mayor of the town. She grew up 3 different times and helped write some of the town's laws. And she was Langston Hughes' best friend during the Harlem Renaissance. How come no one's talking about Zora? So I decided to, but I tagged her on as and Zora to my presentation. Again, she must be very forgiving. But in that moment when I was giving the presentation, I said if I ever got to do it again, she would be the star of my show. She has been since, and she's also, Zora, forgive me, a little bit of a pushy ancestor, and she makes it plain if she wants you to do something, because right after that presentation, my best friend gave us a free vacation. His wife won a vacation, which, how does that happen, right? On the radio, and they couldn't take it. So we come down to Orlando, and I keep seeing the signs for Eatonville, and I'm like, no way. So we detour into Eatonville, and I get to meet Miss NY. And she tells me, you're a Zora fan. I'm like, I'm a what? Because I was given wrong facts all during the presentation. Zora is a mystery, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody who tells a story about Zora is a little different. And so she is largely responsible in many ways for me doing this work today. So this is kind of a full circle moment. Mm. Yeah. But I didn't read the book.
You talked about the power of that inner child, and I think that's something that even though if you are a young child and you are trying to read Their Eyes Are Watching God, that's going to be an adventure for you. Yeah. But I think there's something to be said about how Zora touches all of our inner child. Yes. Because unlike you, I was not a reluctant reader. I was a voracious velociraptor reader. I could read a 200-page book in 2 days and recite passages from it. Now, if you ask me a math problem, not so much. But books were my safe place. Books were one of the worlds that I could escape to all the time, and that's something that I picked up from almost all the women in my family who would be bringing me books from book festivals, carnivals, Barnes & Noble. But the thing was, whenever they would bring me books about Black folks, I tended to put those on the side because the books were typically about certain parts of Black history, be it segregation, be it slavery, or they were books about Black girls that me growing up in the suburbs of Orlando didn't really feel that I could relate to. Or they were moments that made me feel deeply embarrassed or frustrated or angry, and so I had a whole pile of books from Maya Angelou all the way through Toni Morrison to smaller poets that I never touched. Because in the back of my head, I said, why would I want to be reminded how difficult it is to be Black? If I wanted to, I could just go outside and try to play with my neighbor's kids. But one thing that I realized when I started reading Zora is that there was nothing to be embarrassed about. There was nothing to be ashamed about. And really, what you find when you read Zora, even when you just talk about her. I know people who talk about Zora all the time who also have not read her books, but they are so touched by like 2 quotes they heard and are like, those 2 quotes are gonna carry me all the way to Eatonville, you know? But that's the beautiful thing about writing. That's the beautiful thing about storytelling. You don't have to read a whole book to be touched by something. You can read a sentence and want to fly. And I think that's something that Zora kind of teaches us how to do. Because even when I was in college and I was assigned Their Eyes Are Watching God, I was not excited to read that book because if anybody has read that book, you know how Zora be writing. And even though I grew up in community spaces where people talk like that, I had never seen that written before. And so again, that kind of conditioned response, that secondhand embarrassment started to bubble up. But I had a professor who decided to have a class where we only read Toni Morrison books. So reading Their Eyes Are Watching God while you're reading Beloved was a beautiful gastronomy experience, because what I saw in Toni Morrison's works is that she was informed by Zora. I saw in my sci-fi books of Octavia Butler that she was informed by Zora. And when I finally got around to reading Maya Angelou, I saw that she was informed by Zora. And what I came to realize is I can't even begin to talk about these other Black women who have transformed my own writing, my own ways of living as a Black woman, without reading Zora. So finally, I found an audiobook and I read along. And so again, being able to hear Zora, being able to hear those words, you realize this is us. This is all of us. So many of our writers, both those that knew Zora, people who studied Zora, people who walk with Zora, like Alice Walker, know how we exist because of Zora, because Zora was doing that work before a lot of us were able to do that work. And I think that's something that you see and why we still call her one of our foremost Black scholars, even all these years later, because she informs so much of how we manifest. Even people who don't know Zora, because her work touches so many of our spaces, and that's why she proudly wears the title, the mother of Afrofuturism, because so much of what she does is about dreaming and reimagining the spaces in this place and space that was often not created for us to exist fully as people.
And I want to put a pin, because I have a question for you, Christopher. Because I think we're all, in our own way, talking about magic. And we talk about Zora, I like to make it plain. So when we talk about Afrofuturism, reimagining, dreaming, creating image, creating ideas through place and space and time. And so with inner child, if you can tap back into who you were as a child, it's some magic there. But Zora was situated because she still had this same quality, this precocious quality that she had when she was a little girl growing up in Eatonville as an adult. And I think that captures so much. But she also reached back before. In our Western society, we were talking about Sankofa, the idea of going back to the past to get it, right? Zora was doing that in practice, which I think that's why she's so evolutionary, because she was, and revolutionary, because she was doing these things before we had the language.
Right.
And so with Christopher, Chris, can you talk about the language, the importance of the language? Like that's your area, and the magic of language.
Yeah. Right, when you was talking about Sankofa, the EU translation, it says, it is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten. And I think about that when we talk about the inner child and how Zora is crossing these modalities and boundaries and things of that nature. I definitely think that I'm just piecing together some of the things that we've all, or you both said throughout these conversations, but I definitely think that it's interesting that we're talking about Zora, as an anthropologist first in a way, because a lot of people know her for the literature, and I feel like Their Eyes was really popular, and that's really what popularized her in a sense. But I feel like she was still belittled or not as big and broadcasted as she should have been in her time, due to, people say that it was because of, the issues with the literary scholars of the time, but of course, it wasn't just that, right? So it was because of the racial and feminist approaches that she brought to her work that really wasn't happening during the time. And I feel like because of that, and because of the dialect that she, was tried and true to, she allowed the people to speak for themselves. And that's one big thing with ethnography, is that going into cultures, you should allow people to speak for themselves, right? And I feel like that's really the part the language part that differentiates her from her peers is because that she was trying to really bring forth the truth of the people and not just like what anthropologists thought, what outsiders thought, but she was both the insider and outsider, kind of like toggling these lines of self and other, of the native researcher and the experienced ethnographer. So I feel like these things are dichotomies that she was playing with in her language by keeping the actual, sounds and dialect of the people that she was studying. But yeah, so I am interested, as you said, in the rhetoric part of it. And rhetoric, I would say, is more so how we carry language, not necessarily what we're saying, but it's like how we're saying it, how we're producing it, how are we transferring it from person to person, group to group, generation to generation. So when I was in my master's program at Jackson State University, I did my thesis on Zora specifically and her autoethnographies, her ethnographic novels. And I was interested in how she went into these cultures and gathered cultural memes of these things and then broadcasted it to multiple audiences. So therefore she had to be, in a way, dualistic in the way that she approached language, because she was talking to, the white anthropologists, but also she was talking to the native people that may have understood the rituals and the language that she spoke about, whereas maybe the anthropologists thought of it in a scientific way. But yeah, so that was my master's thesis, and it was interesting when I moved to Kansas for my PhD and started working at the history of Black writing. That's how I got connected to here, to Eatonville, through internship with the Zora Neale Hurston Festival. So I feel like it was, in a way, spirit-led. Me encountering Zora as a child and then being brought here to Eatonville. And in a way, you both talked about Zora as an ancestor, right? So as someone who is now venerated, elevated in ancestral status. And I feel like that part is very important for thinking about how she came back really from the dead in a way to give us some type of spirit of the folk that really was missing in anthropology during her time, but also that we really needed in this century right now to understand how to see ourselves and engage with the people as well. So yeah.
If I could put on my scholar hat so I can make sure that we're all grounded, because sometimes us who love Zora and we're rooted in this work, it's really easy to forget that we may be introducing some people to Zora. So if I could take a minute to do that, we may have put the cart ahead of the horse, the wagon ahead of the horse, which I tend to do a lot. But just to give you some biographical information and then some context. So Zora Neale Hurston was born in Nottasuga, Alabama, January 7th, 1891. Nottasuga is significant for two reasons to me. First off, it was just a couple of miles from Tuskegee Institute. And this town itself is built off the principles of Booker T. Washington. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps, economic sustainability, personal solvency first. You see in Zora's politics and her clashes with Black thought leaders, her premise is very different. She never subscribed to the idea that her people, our people, were victims. Never subscribed to the idea that to be considered worthy or equal, we had to assimilate into white culture, which left her out of step with her Black male contemporaries, but also the academics, and also Black thought leaders in organizations such as the NAACP and the Urban League. Zora lived at first, her first 13 years were for a life of privilege because in Nottasuga, Alabama, her mother came from a very well-to-do family. They owned 5 acres of land where they farmed clingstone peaches. Miss Lucy, Potts Hurston, Zora's mother decided to marry John Hurston, who was said to be the son of the plantation owner. He had been born into slavery, right? So the Potts wanted to disassociate with the across the creek Negroes. And John Hurston was, for all intents and purposes, across the creek. He didn't have a cent to his name. He was a sharecropper, and he was rumored to be the son of his master. High yellow, big old, they call him Big N, so big Negro for sensitivity purposes. Lucy Hurston was 90 pounds soaking wet, brown, but she was brilliant, deep brown, and she was a school teacher. She walked away, and I love this bit of history. She gave up her very cushy trust money and land she was set to inherit to marry John, which sets forth some independence, some feminism we don't talk about, because I say for our ancestral mothers who were trailblazing, who were pioneers, who were fiery and sassy just like Zora, because we can't call their names, because we don't know what they did, we also call them Zora. So Zora moved to Eatonville when she was just a toddler with her family, but her father came here ahead of the family, and they were a part of the pioneering families of Eatonville. And so this is important and significant because it was not, y'all can guess, okay, who do y'all think was the brains of the operation, Lucy or John, right? Okay, someone knows. So John Hurston was okay with being an itinerant pastor. He was a carpenter. Miss Lucy said, I'm tired of paying rent, which we be talking about now, don't we? I'm tired of paying rent. We paying rent or we paying a mortgage. So she said, we ought to buy some land. And John did not want to buy the land. He was like, that's a big undertaking. She was like, we're going to do it. And they did it. And so right on Kennedy Boulevard, they had 5 acres of land, right? So he's the preacher at Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church. He's a carpenter, but he's also the pastor up in Sanford, 16 miles from here, at Zion Hope Missionary Baptist Church. So you go up to Sanford, there's a historic Goldsboro, and it was founded by the blood brother of the founder of Eatonville. So they call him Papa William Clark up there, Papa Clark, and down here we have Joe Clark. And this Sanford and Eatonville, the Hurstons are ingratiated in the establishments of these towns. John Hurston wrote some of the town's laws that still exist in Eatonville today. Now, some of them was just downright foolish. I don't know if I told y'all this. One of his laws was that pregnant dogs couldn't walk out on the street because they might offend the sensible women. Which I was like, so y'all just need somebody to come in and do the work. But they had status here. In fact, even though Eatonville was an all-black town, racism may not have been a thing, right? We're situated between Maitland and Orlando, right? This small, all-black town. Class and colorism still was. So remember, John high yellow, Zora high yellow. Her mother is brown, but she was an ex-school teacher who was a stay-at-home mom. That was not the regular rigmarole in Eatonville, even in that time. And so Zora, she tells stories that they had so much abundance that they would use leftover eggs and fruit and tangerines and guavas as missiles to throw at the neighbors' children. Now remember, she was born in 1891. I didn't know that there were black families in this world, in our country, in the 1890s and 1910s who had abundance that they could waste food. Today, if I waste some food, I hear my grandmother's voice in my head. And so that's important for another reason. During the Harlem Renaissance, everybody heard of the Harlem Renaissance? Has everyone? Y'all gotta, don't leave me up here like y'all heard of it, because I gotta know how much I gotta tell you. Scott is like, yeah. Okay, so the Harlem Renaissance is made up of Northern black folks, right? And who learned that the Harlem Renaissance was an artistic movement? Right? That's a lie. And let me tell you why. I know, right? I'm gonna tell you why. Because the Harlem Renaissance was started, Zora credits Charles S. Johnson. He was the research director of the Urban League, which is a political organization. She credits him because when she was at Howard from 1918 to 1924, She was rubbing elbows with W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson. So we talk NAACP and Urban League. In May 1st, 1925, Charles S. Johnson decides that he's going to take the literary journal he started called The Opportunity, right? And instead of just publishing, now he wants to get white progressive politicians and artists and all of these young black artists such as Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Connie Cullen, Wallace Thurman, Dorothy West, Georgia Douglas Johnson. He's gonna put them all in the same room so these young black artists can get patronage. Because political movement, political organization, what the NAACP and Urban League is seeking to answer at this time is now that slavery is over, we're a generation or two after it, who are black people? And they use these black artists to produce work to show anybody heard of New Negro? The New Negro. But these people are from the North. You have Harvard-educated W.E.B. Du Bois, Rhodes Scholar, even though he wasn't really a Rhodes Scholar, Elaine Locke. And they're saying, we're going to assimilate. But Zora is saying, y'all don't even know what y'all talking about. Y'all think we all sharecroppers and we broke and we destitute and we strung up from trees every other day. But there is joy, and I can prove it because I've lived it. But when it was in fashion and when it served them, they was good with it. When it didn't, they ostracized Zora. You're making us look unintelligent, right? You're speaking like you're still on a plantation. And Zora said black people did a mighty lot with the English language that doesn't have a lot of feeling in it. Black idiom poetry, right? And so this is where Zora comes in because she's a Southern black woman coming in with the map of Dixie on her tongue. She can talk to anybody, anywhere. But she's at the center of a political movement trying to produce art and trying to produce authentic art centered on black and indigenous cultures at a time where even black people themselves have secondhand shame and embarrassment about who they are. So I just want to give y'all that so we understand where she is even in the Harlem Renaissance, because her contemporaries, even though y'all ever read Uncle Tom's Cabin, Richard Wright? That's homework, so I'm not a professor. They're the professors, but I'm not the professor. But if you read Richard Wright's work, any criticism he has about Zora using this language is mighty funny, because if you read his work, he's trying to do the same. He has no ethnographic training, right? He knows nothing about language, because even as we speak in our relaxed languages, capturing phonetic spelling for a novel-length text, I did it in my children's book, and it was hard. She's doing it in 200 and 250-page novels. And if you read her work, just read the dialogue, and then read Richard Wright's work, you mad because you can't do it. You're mad because you can't do it. So Christopher, and this is Zora's far out. Daniel Black, Dr. Daniel Black, when I interviewed him for the trust, he said something beautiful, and next time I talk to him, I have to tell him he needs to trademark that. He said Zora explored every denomination of being human. There was a fluidity of her. She did not need a title. She did not need the language. She went out and got it. And so one of those things was the hoodoo and conjure, because at that point, when Zora's doing it, she's going to New Orleans, right? Initiating into voodoo, like full-on voodoo priestess, traveling to Jamaica and Haiti to study conjure. And at that time, it wasn't that it was new, it was how she did it. And I think that's why we all love Zora, is how she did it. Everything black, everything conjure, hoodoo, African traditional religions was done in a very derogatory manner. And Zora was like, no, I can show you this is beautiful in these roots, even to black people, West Africa. We still home. We still carry the African drum under our skin. So Christopher, let's talk about this hoodoo, because this lady is crazy. She's out there in the backwoods initiating land hours and days at a time with snake skins on her, no food, no water. Let's talk about that.
Right. Yeah, so I feel like the way that she described hoodoo is thinking about hoodoo as a continuation, of African traditional practices. I'm really interested in Mules and Men, right? So at the beginning, or maybe the first part of Mules and Men, she gathers folklore and stories, which is, I would say, is still an ethnographic practice, right? Because it's still talking, ethnography, right, is a study, like a study of anthropology, a part of anthropology, the study of human culture. But ethnography, in a way, you study human culture, you study humans to see their relationship with their own culture. So that's really what Zora did when she went to these places to engage in hoodoo and conjure, voodoo and obia in Jamaica. So I feel like she really wanted to enter into the practice and understand it from a personal perspective, because her contemporary, I believe his name was Robert Talent, who wrote Voodoo in New Orleans, I believe. So he presented voodoo in a way that was really derogatory, really kind of like bombastic when it comes to how Black people practice these cultures. But Hurston herself wanted to be a part of the culture, so that's why she went into the culture to study hoodoo. And I am really interested in her long essay, Hoodoo in America, because she really hones in on the identities of these practitioners. And I feel like that really hadn't been done before her time, that she had their names, where they were from. And when it comes to hoodoo doctors, most hoodoo doctors are specialized, so they specialize in like, oh, I'm a hoodoo doctor that can help you with court cases, or I'm a hoodoo doctor that can help you with love relationships. So she really emphasized their specialities in a way that was never done before, to humanize the practice, to say that this is a part of our culture, and it shouldn't be seen as only a superstition, even though it's still, seen as a superstition today. But I think that she was one of the first people in the U.S. to professionalize hoodoo, to say that this is a professional practice, that people are actually serious about this and have clients, and so it's a life and it's a way of being when it comes to hoodoo culture. So yeah.
And she got some roots put on her in Haiti, because people didn't like what she was doing. You know about that? Yeah. So Zora was like, I know it because I've experienced it firsthand. They were saying she was getting a little bit ahead of herself, because it is a practice as relevant, as true as any other religious practice. And she had this hypothesis. She said that she never believed that Black people were Christians, that we were pagans and we just traded in the names of our orishas, our gods, for a single god for safety. And I mean, it don't matter. As long as you're Black in America, you're gonna have some of that, like, this is what we have to do to be safe. And I find that interesting, especially with her dad being a very successful itinerant preacher.
Right.
So that's radical in and of itself.
Right. And then Jonas Gordvine, which is kind of like, mimicked after her father. There's one piece in it where he's like on the pulpit, but he's like calling down the Congo gods, So I feel like there's this idea that really isn't thought about much, that I would say that hoodoo, hoodoo being kind of like the combination of African cultures that was stabilized in the U.S. as, enslaved Africans came over here. So it's kind of like the mixture of, their spiritual practices and spiritual culture, along with what was going on here in the U.S., right? So I feel like hoodoo in itself is the first the first African-American religion, even before Christianity, or Black Christianity as it occurred today. I feel like hoodoo was really the predecessor of how we understand spiritual imagination, the Black spiritual imagination. And I feel like Hurston was saying that, 100 years ago. So like she already knew that Black people were never, as she said, Christian, but there's always some type of, when we carry the spirit, right, there's always some type of cultural aspect, African aspect, even in the Black church, right, that would be attached to our practices, like, if you've heard of shouting and catching the spirit, I feel like those are very similar to the possession that happens in African traditional practices. So yeah, I mean, I'm interested in this like scholarly, but I am also a practitioner of African traditional religions, and I've been initiated. I haven't, laid on snakeskins, but I've been initiated into a few African cultural practices, and it's because of Zora and the way that she did it is really what ultimately inspired me to do the same thing. So the move from kind of like this Pentecostal, sanctified church to practicing African diasporic religions is always challenging for me, especially, my family. They really don't even know everything that I'm doing, but I feel like there's still a lot of similarities in how the spirit is dealt with in both of those spaces.
Absolutely. And I don't know if I ever told you. First off, I think that's beautiful because I think that's what's very special about Zora. It doesn't matter if you're into politics, if you're into anthropology, literature, theater. Zora got something for you. She has something for everyone, so much so that my son, he's 7, his birthday is 2 days before Zora's. You want to wave to everybody? Yeah. And Zora is like his spiritual grandmother. It's so funny. He can play Zora trivia, and he can tell you things about Zora, so I think that's a magical element too. Even the way that she talked, he likes to practice her language and perform her language, which I love. But Christopher, I have something for you. I don't know if I ever told you this, but Zora was Zora by the time she went to Jamaica and Haiti. She had a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1936 that was renewed in 1937, and it was very uncharacteristic of the Guggenheims to give a fellowship twice, right? And so she went to Jamaica and Haiti to study conjure, trance, and religion. So trance is the language that she uses, and you can read about that in Tell My Horse. But one of the interesting things is that Zora actually wanted to go to West Africa first. So in 1934, she put in an application to go to West Africa, and so I see, very visual, so I see Zora working through her life to create a bridge, to reconnect Black Southern people, right, to West Africa, to connect our African diasporic brothers and sisters to West Africa to say, hey, over here y'all eating cassava, over there they eating plantain, but there's different iterations of the same practices, as Sidney was saying, over and over again. But of course, this is something else that's important to know about anthropology. When there was a certain place or subject that became of interest, they swooped down on there like crows and hawks and vultures, right? So even we see Zora in 1927, Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black History Month, he actually funded half of Zora's first fellowship. It was $1,400 total. And he had certain asks, because we all know we grown enough to know once you get the money, like you got to do something for the money. They don't just give it to you and let you do whatever. And so he sent her on a field tour, her very first field tour in 1927. She first came to Eatonville, but she also went to St. Augustine to study Fort Mose. But I think the thing that we hold most important from that trip is she went to visit Oluwale Kasula, Cudjoe Lewis, in Mobile, right outside of Mobile, Alabama, in Africatown. And raise y'all hand, y'all think Zora wanted to do that? Do you think she wanted to? This is the man who's considered the last living formerly enslaved individual in our country. You think Zora wanted to do it? She want to go talk to Kojo? You say yeah? Who say yeah? Raise your hand for yeah. She was like, no. First off, her and Langston Hughes become friends because they run into each other when she's initiating into voodoo in New Orleans. And so much so that they road trip back from New Orleans through Georgia all the way up to New York, which I was like, y'all was real friends that they fell out. But y'all was real friends then. You didn't even have air conditioning, so I can't imagine that. I get real cranky. But she did not. She did not want to go see Oluwale Kasula. She wrote Langston Hughes a letter that says, I have to go see him before he died because he's so old, right? Which I don't judge Zora too harshly because, listen, if I ever die, y'all, I'm charging all of y'all. Don't ever let anybody read all of my text messages, right? Because her letters, they're essentially text messages to her best friend. And so she did not want to interview him. Instead, she wanted to be out in the field with the people studying the practices. And she's like, okay, other people have already done this. He doesn't say anything of interest. And Oluwale Kasula also did not want to talk to Zora because he's already had all of these people coming to talk to him. And I cannot imagine the pain of having to constantly relive that for others' entertainment and study. So in 1927, Zora was unsuccessful. She returned to Barnard to talk to Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology, her mentor, with her tail tucked between her legs because this man would not talk to her. But Zora did something which I love. I love to show the humanness of Zora because when we think that our ancestors, our historic figures are perfect, then we hold ourselves to a standard that's impossible and we actually end up not doing the work. Right. So Zora could not get much out of this man whatsoever. And so she actually decided to plagiarize this article that Carter G. Woodson is going to publish in the Journal of African American Life, I believe it was called. And she plagiarized from a white woman, Emma Langdon Roach's book, Historic Sketches of Something. If I remember her name, I never remember the full title. And right. If I remember the full title, I never remember her name. You're right. But she plagiarizes it, and Carter G. Woodson still publishes it. And I think what would have happened to her career had she been caught, right? Or had he not published it. But Zora, once she got a bone in her mouth, she could be a pit bull. And so she was like, I know that I failed. No one made her do it. She said, I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna talk to him. Because now he messing with my status. I gotta go prove that I am the Zora that I think I am. And so she goes back in 1928 and she does something different, which was not done in science at that time. Because it was a take. I'm pulling this information from you and it's what can I get? Right. Zora decides she gonna go back. She gonna take him watermelon. She gonna take him clingstone peaches, pecans, and if she has to go back and just sit on the porch with him while he goes down memory lane, when he goes back to Africa, when he's envisioning his mother, when he's envisioning what happened to him, when he's envisioning starting Africa Town, but losing his wife and his children and being lonely, she sits and she holds space with him. So even though we're talking about space as location, space is also an existence of energy. She's holding space for him to be where he is. And he talks to her like he's not talked to anybody else. In that book, she recorded his personal narrative phonetically, the entire thing. And this is beyond me because this is not Zora's native language, right? This is not Eatonville language because you have a man who's coming from present-day Benin. So now you're talking about you're able to listen to and appreciate languages from far off and still capture them phonetically. And that's important because for me, Barracoon was the first book I read that was written by Zora, but the book wasn't published until 2018. And Dr. Kendi always reminds me, he's like, you just been doing this 5 years? And I'm like, yeah, it defies logic. It defies logic. 2018, her work is not published, but when you read it, for me, it brought my grandfather who is from Mississippi. I'm like, oh, at first I read it, I was like, I don't know what any of this is. Then I thought of his voice. And it's like music. It's like you feel something different. And so back to the fellowship, Oluwale Kasula, Kojo Lewis, asked Zora, because she had told him she was going to go back to West Africa. And he said, when your feet hit the Africa soil, call out my name, because she also did something else special. She did not call him Kojo. She called him by his African name, Oluwale Kasula. The respect there to say, I'm going to see you as human, not as property, and not the label you still carry as property, says a lot. So he said, when you get to West Africa, call out my name, and maybe somebody said, oh yeah, Kasula, I know him. Well, Zora never got to West Africa, right? And so when I went in 2019, that was actually the first time I thought I could contribute something to Zora's legacy. I called out both of their names. And that's space and place and time. Like, she was bringing forth the ancestors so we could have them today. She was bringing forth the religion so we can have it today. Because all people that I know, Black people I know, that are like, yes, ATR, I do it, even myself having an altar for Zora, it's because of her. I don't know anybody else who was doing that. Yeah. And I was like, you was doing it back then? So yes, Sidney.
That's one. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No, Christopher.
No, go ahead.
Oh, no, like, both of you have said so much that I've just been soaking up and just smiling here, just taking it all in. But what you just said, that space, place, and time, that is what Zora brought us. That is what Zora has gifted to us. That is why we call her the mother of Afrofuturism. Now, you heard me say that word before, but how many of you have heard this term, Afrofuturism, before?
Or did they heard it, they know what it means. That's the thing.
So how many of you saw Black Panther when it came out? Cool. Afrofuturism is this word that if you have your vocab list that I see some of you jotting down, add this word to that list, because Zora gave us that word before we even had that word. Afrofuturism is this speculative movement that was born and brought to life during the 1970s and 80s in Black America, where we took our languages, our learnings, and our liberation efforts and allowed them to meet and merge, to borrow a word from Christopher. So when we think about what Afrofuturism is academically, you'll hear people talk about Sun Ra, you'll hear people talk about Octavia Butler, and people you never even heard of. But let's talk about Afrofuturism as a communal space. Afrofuturism came out of our alienation, our displacement, our segregation in this country. If we talk about the transatlantic slave trade all the way through Jim and Jane Crow, even to today, Afrofuturism is a tool that we utilize in our communities for recovery and reclamation, whether that's through art, whether that's through science fiction, whether that's through folklore. And typically when people talk about Afrofuturism, they're talking about it in sci-fi spaces. So they're talking about it in Wakanda. But Wakanda was born out of our diasporic knowledge. It was out of our knowings that we as Black Americans brought back to life. It is part of our recovery work. So even though we can vibe and say, yay, we have a Black superhero now, we also have to thank Zora, because Zora created so many pathways for us to be able to do that recovery work. So even when I study environmental history, I have to invoke Zora, because she talked about hurricanes. Zora talked about environmental racism before we had an environmental justice movement, because she was talking about the displacement of our community knowledge. She was talking about the displacement of our homes that we now call gentrification. She was talking about things before we even had a lexicon to that in the English language. So Afrofuturism to me is a term that can be as big as outer space, or it can be as simple as sitting on your grandma's porch, because that's what Zora did. She took us to the porch and she talked. And more than that, she held space. And that's something that is so intrinsic to when we think about these terms. So whether, again, we're talking about superheroes or we're talking about our African star lore, we're holding space. All of us in this space, all of you listening virtually, we're holding space together. We're having a porch talk here.
We are, and I have chills. Just 2 seconds. You know the other movie that's not, if anybody knows Gina Prince Blythewood, let her know, tell her to call me. Because in Barracoon, Oluwale Kasula is talking about being captured by the women warriors portrayed in Woman King. And it was an interview. Gina, I ain't trying to start stuff with you. I just want to talk to you. She was saying there's no one who has recorded the experience. I was like, yeah, Zora did that in 1927, 1928 on a man's porch. That way he was sitting barefoot and had first-hand account of what it was like. Viola could call me too, so if anybody know Viola Davis, just so that they know, because you said that earlier, even if you don't know Zora, you know Zora. Descendant on Netflix, you hear Zora's voice, you see them reading Barracoon, and these are descendants of the people who were illegally bought over on the ship on a bet, when the transatlantic slave trade had already been abolished. But Zora holds the record to inform this full documentary. That's winning awards. And I'm like, it's cool, I love it all, but like, let's call her name. Because Zora left so much that's still even being discovered today.
Absolutely.
And just that, I feel like Zora is a space maker as well, right? Like
Yeah.
a space creator, more than just holding space, which she is doing, but I feel like she's still creating something that hasn't been done before, still, you know, like today. And I feel like definitely she was an undisciplined ethnographer in this way, so she was practicing in a way that never been done before, even though France Boas presented this theory of cultural relativity, right? So seeing cultures as intelligent in and of themselves and not just measured by a Western standard in that way. But it's still interesting though, because I see Conjure as strictly Afrofuturistic, because it's like nudging the universe, right? It's calling people from the past. It's calling in various spirits to kind of like affect the universe in a particular way. So I think that even when Alice Walker went to, or discovered Hurston, discovered Zora, and then went to look for her, it was because she was studying voodoo, and she needed somebody black talking about the practices of our people. So I feel like because of voodoo, in a way, Hurston was brought into this present day time, past space, time, and place, to really bring us something that, again, no one else had done before her.
Yeah.
I think you brought up something that's just so delicious, this idea of space making as well. We say Zora's an Afrofuturist, but she's also an alchemist because she's making magic in her work. She's making memories for us. Zora's been gone from this realm for quite some time.
Since 1960.
But she's still making memories for us. So when we talk about afterlives, we know for many of us that are in eco-spiritual spaces that death is not the end of a relationship. But Zora shows us just how powerful your afterlife can be, how much we're learning about Zora, how much we're getting to know Zora, even after all these years. And you think about, to your point about conjuring, I think of how much recovery work, reclamation work I've been able to do just by reading Zora, and then going and engaging with my siblings who are in West Africa, who are in the Caribbean, and realizing that our supposed separate Black American experience is so rooted in these other spaces as well, that literally when I was in Ghana working at a children's home, I was looking how they were making some of their recipes and saying, oh, this looks like what my auntie makes. So one night I was cooking and they said, oh, sister, this is our food. You're reconnecting with us. I cried so much while I was over there, but it was all because you were able to have that reconnective tissue. And again, Zora shows us how we do those reconnections, how we make space, how we hold space, and how we do a little bit of alchemy to create something even more.
She left us that bridge to walk across. So now we got to do a bridge to the audience. Because I want to make sure, obviously we could talk about Zora all day. You guys can ask us questions. How do you want to do that, Trent? What you want to do? We're going to make it happen.
What's up?
Pretty much what's up.
All right, so we have people that are listening to us by live stream, and so if you can project when you ask your questions, that would work. If you would rather us bring the mic around, we have people to bring the mic around. Whatever you ask, our panelists will try to rephrase it or repeat it so that the people online can hear. So we'll open it up for questions now.
Y'all don't be shy now. All right.
I'll be like my daughter and go first.
Yay.
So when you were talking about Conjure and Zora the Space Maker and Afrofuturistic, I wrote a question down about the strength of Zora and this idea of coming to look for her. And I feel like I was drawn, I was drawn to this conference. I've never been to this conference before. And so I was wondering if, can you speak to, I feel like for me coming down here, it's like as we take on challenges, I'm working on looking at Black towns in the America and Black community and Black culture and sort of documenting it because I'm from Chicago and I feel like it's being restricted and we need to preserve and protect and restore in a sense, like the Black community. So I was wondering, can you speak to just this coming to look for her and the strength of Zora? Maybe as my...
I got to tell her something.
Okay.
I cannot resist. So I think one of the biggest things is that a lot of times we try to preserve larger space, but we don't try to reclaim for self. And I think that's huge because you're from Chicago. I have to tell y'all a story. I'm a storyteller. So Zora's rival, self-appointed rival, was Katherine Dunham, who was the mother of modern dance, right? And so Zora, before she got a Guggenheim, she actually had a Rosenwald Foundation Fellowship. And Zora visited Fisk University because a lot of times when we think about the Chitlin Circuit, we only think about the performers. But these artists and academics also did the Chitlin Circuit, and they would do speeches on the college campuses in that town. Then at night they would party, which I love that for them. Well, Zora visited Fisk, and she told Thomas E. Jones, the president of Fisk University, that he ran his school like a plantation, like a Georgia plantation, and all his faculty was just good old Uncle Tom's. Well, the Rosenwald family happened to be close friends with Thomas E. Jones, and they reduced her fellowship so much that she could not afford to get her PhD that she wanted to, that she could not afford to go to Jamaica and Haiti. But they sent Katherine Dunham on her itinerary. So reclaiming for self, Zora has been in your Chicago space because Katherine Dunham was an anthropologist much younger than Zora, being trained in Chicago under Melville Herskovitz. So that's my thing, just self. Y'all want to answer the actual question?
I can speak to the community part. I'm a daughter of a Southside Chicago girl. But one of the things that I see is so important for our communities as we celebrate Zora, we're also celebrating Edenville, this town where Zora, in her own words, she said she became a Zora. So when we think about what is a Black community, whether we're talking about a neighborhood, whether we're talking about a town, whether we're talking about a city or a part of a city, we're really talking about how are these spaces allowing us to make space. Again, when we talk about Zora, we're talking about somebody who navigated an environment that was not created for her to exist fully. And yet, look at what she was able to do with that, how she continued to return to Edenville, how she invoked Edenville. When we look at Black towns outside of Edenville, what you see is that Edenville still pops up. When I was up on the eastern shore of Maryland this past summer, there were people up there who had relatives they remember coming to visit in Edenville. People who live in other Black cities who say that we remember taking trips there. People who talk about our history in the state of Florida, whether we're talking about the Ocoee Massacre or Rosewood, who still talk about Edenville and say all of these horrible things were happening. Florida, during the late 19th century into the early 20th century, was one of the most dangerous places to be as a Black person. And yet Edenville was never burned down. We have Rosewood, we have the Ocoee Massacre, we have a multitude of violence against Black people. But Edenville remained. And that in and of itself is magic to me.
Yeah. And I think it starts, like, once Zora reaches for you, once our ancestors reach for you, because I don't think it's just Zora. She's bringing the ancestors, like, from around the world to say, come on in, I'm inviting you in to reimagining, reclaiming, and truly exploring. Because just like I said, 16 miles up the road, you have Sanford, but historic Goldsboro was founded by the blood brother of the founder of Eatonville. And so once you come, really explore and come back. Like, I'm really into sense of place research, so I'm always looking for Zora. When I come down, I don't even like to drive. Zora takes me on these 2-hour excursions. So yesterday I was up in Fort Pierce, and her last house that she lived in still stands there. That's where she's buried. That's where Alice Walker in 1973 came down and marked her unmarked grave. And so I think not just engaging with our ancestors because of their work, but who they were. Just open your mind. I think that's part of Afrofuturism too, because we may not have the full history, but if we can open our minds and our hearts, the land will call to you. The places will definitely call to you. Because I've had magic with Zora, even seeing her handwritten, Their Eyes Are Watching God manuscript at Yale. I showed up in the t-shirt I slept in, so Zora.
Yeah, I think, I think I'm understanding your question, but I'm also just bringing it to like maybe a theoretical space, because I feel like that's where it was working for me. I feel like Zora, since she was a Native researcher, right, and I wanted to take on that identity myself. So when I was practicing hoodoo and I wanted to like research it, I feel like I was doing the same thing that she was doing in a way. And I do have to share this one story because Alice Walker went back to Fort Pierce, and I was the one, so my first time in Eatonville was in 2019, so the 30th year anniversary of the festival, and I was the one to drive Alice Walker and Valerie Boyd, God rest her soul, and other people.
Christopher, stop. Stop. Hold on. Y'all see how casually he just said that? I was the one to drive Alice Walker. Can you repeat that and say it right?
I just had to tell this, but I keep forgetting to lead with this story. I drove her to Fort Pierce. And I remember like stopping at the Piggly Wiggly, and she like bought us all these like wine and things to like give to to give to Zora when we reached her grave. And then we were like driving around Fort Pierce and trying to find the grave, and I like cracked a joke like, "Oh, we're still in search of our mother's gardens." But
how did that go?
I mean, there was like a little laugh. I mean, no one really thought it was. But I do think that because of what Alice Walker has done and recovering this work, I feel like it has left an imprint on my spirituality and my spiritual practice. And even with whatever I'm doing, even in teaching and research, I want to center womanism, which is in a way Black feminism, but it's more centered on spirituality and place and kind of like the context of how we are existing in racial class and sexual dynamics. So we can't tear those things apart. It's all intersectional in that way. And I feel like womanism in a way helps me ground what I'm doing in the need for spirituality, the need for understanding that we're in a reality that's not just material, that it's mixed. It's an ecological mixture of material, spirit, and energy and other things. And I feel like because of that, because of Alice Walker and Zora and like this lineage of people, I find a grounding for myself in what I'm doing.
Can I give homework?
Yes.
Okay, so one of the things, we can never condense all that we know and our experience and love of Zora into any of these panels. I was here in 2022. I did a 3-day, 4-event series. And I talked about Zora for over 10 hours, and I still was not done. So when we talk about what's next, where do you go next if you want to start looking for Zora and finding Zora? Christopher mentioned Valerie Boyd, who is she was the leading biographer of Zora. Her beautiful book, Zora Neale Hurston, Wrapped in Rainbows, The Life of Zora Neale Hurston, is by far, I don't even read nonfiction like that, but I read that book over and over again. It is my Zora Bible, if you will. Valerie Boyd, she passed away. She actually made it to Zora Fest, not last year, 2022, and then she passed away the next month. And so we think about that as she's fighting for her own survival with one of her last breaths, she came to venerate Zora. That alone, read the book. But it truly has so much. Any page you turn to, there's a wealth of knowledge, and we want to honor her for doing that work. So there is Zora, then there's Alice Walker, then there's Valerie Boyd, who is continuing the lineage. And because of Valerie Boyd, I do this work because she married so beautifully scholarship and true Black woman love. I was like, oh, I could lead with love. So I know a lot about Zora, but the love is what I use to connect first. The stories are what I use. So definitely Valerie Boyd's book. And Valerie Boyd, one of her last works was that she actually edited Alice Walker's journals, which are very interesting because she talks about Zora and Langston in there. I was like, you were Langston's friend? How could you, Alice? Right. Don't get me in trouble with Alice Walker. But yeah, she was also friends with Langston Hughes. So Valerie Boyd edited those journals, and that is Gathering Blossoms Under Fire. And then the other book I recommend, you can actually read Zora's text messages, her letters, because Zora wrote letters to everybody. If she ain't like the way the meat looked at the grocery store, she was writing a letter. But Carla Kaplan edited 600 letters written by Zora, and that's Zora Neale Hurston, A Life in Letters by Carla Kaplan. Those two are my Zora Bibles. And actually, you can listen to Carla talk. The Trust has a YouTube series called It's All About Zora, and Carla's interview with me will air on the 28th of this month, which is Zora's, and I call it her ancestor anniversary. So yeah, that's y'all homework. Other questions? Oh, yay.
What's first?
Oh, right here. She's like, no, yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Carolina, so thank you for this opportunity. I need to talk about me a little bit because my English is really, really bad, and I am nervous to talk. So I am from Brazil. I am a sociology, a PhD sociology, and my research is about Zora. So this is really nice. I'm really happy to be here. And, you talk about ancestors, and before I came here, I start my religion life just in the last year. And my mom told me, oh, you are looking for our ancestors, right? And I was, what? So this is really nice. And my question is about, I don't know, it's a challenge in my research right now, but I am trying to connect Zora with Brazil and Latin America, but I can't find a lot of works about this. So
I got you covered, girl. First off, your English is fine. I take pride in messing up the English language because it's not my native tongue. You're fine. I understood her. Y'all understood?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Perfectly.
So even though it's not Brazil, Zora went to the Bahamas to study indigenous religion there, and then also Honduras. So Professor Sharoni, I don't know if she's doctor. If she is, please forgive me, Dr. Sharoni Green. She had a book that just released that talks about Zora's time in Honduras. And so I think that will help connect you with Latin America, also her time in Miami. Zora started there first and ended there, right? So started in the Bahamas by way of Miami, because she could just take a ship over to get to the Bahamas. And then her last field work was in Honduras, international field work. So Sharoni Green.
Could you spell Sharoni?
Sharony. I feel like I'm in a spelling bee.
Next, could you?
And I remember the cover has like pineapples on the front. And I don't have direct connection with her, but she is on Instagram. And if you can find her information, reach out to her and tell her, because Zora take you places, trust me. Trust me. Just tell her about your research and what you're doing, and hopefully she'll connect with you. But welcome.
And I'm not sure exactly, what you're researching about Brazil, but I am interested in like Brazilian religion as well. And I'm interested in hoodoo and its like Kakongo or Congo connections, like ancient Congo religion connections. And there's many people that talk about Congo religion. So I don't know if you're approaching this from a religious standpoint.
Talk later.
Yeah, but I feel like there's a connection between hoodoo and voodoo, as well as practices like Umbanda and Kimbanda, because of the way that they like continue Congo practices of kind of like ancestral veneration, but it's more macumba, right? So it's more like kind of like underground or darker magic, and I feel like hoodoo in a way is still doing that same thing. It does have like harming practices, like hoodoo is about healing, but there's also harming practices that practitioners use to protect their communities and themselves. And so obviously coming from kind of like a West African point of view, it's not as dichotomous as like good Christian and bad. So people still do both in a way. And I feel like the Congo religion piece could help weave together what Hurston did as well as maybe what you're interested in.
Christopher, is that an offer to support?
Yes.
Okay, there you go.
Because Umbanda in Brazil is kind of, well, this can be disrespectful, but it's not. But Umbanda is more Vanish, It's kind of Vanish. It's more mixed with Christianism and the sound. Yeah. And Brazil is the second country with most black people in the world, so we have a lot of religion.
Right.
I am from Candomblé. It's more traditional. It's from Nigeria. So it's kind of different too, and we have a lot of this experience there. So with native people too. So it's really nice, and I am trying to do this in my work too, but it's harder for me because I am a babe in my religion, so I don't
You're
know
doing it.
basically
Yes.
nothing,
We all start somewhere. Awesome.
But thank you so much.
And Scott, I know that you have some people online, some viewers online.
We do have a question from the webinar. How do you understand Hurston's 1955 letter in in the Orlando Sentinel on Brown v. BOE as part of her legacy?
So Brown versus Board, you want to take that, Sidney?
Oh, I got so many thoughts. I think I'll let you start.
Okay, so actually when I initially did my research on Zora, once I got to finding out she opposed Brown versus Board, I was like, dang, this might be it. This might be the end of the road for us. But if you really take the time to read the letter, which was edited, and this is always a scary thing. We do lots of talking and teaching, but someone can take a soundbite. They can, a journalist can just parse whatever you've written to frame their story the way that they want it to be framed. And so at that time, Zora, who talked a lot, I could relate, they would take her words and use them in ways that furthered the divide between Zora herself and the Black community. But a lot of our grandparents, I got Southern grandparents, even though I'm not from the South, they were what we would call, which is not the best term, segregationists. But this idea of, I say like, segregation and gentrification are cousins, right? And they cousins that may not have gotten along, but what happened is when Brown versus Board was put into effect, and this was Zora's point, the children were integrated, but black children were integrated into white schools. The administration and the teachers were not integrated, right? And so you lose this cultural element to the teaching and this misunderstanding, because anytime someone sees you as a monster, how much are they gonna educate you, protect you, support your way of life? They're not. But then you also see a breakdown of economy, because as black children are going to schools across town, because Eatonville had Hungerford, right up there on Kennedy Boulevard next to the library. So you can live, work, play, build community in your community, but now when your kids aren't here, they can't help with the farming, the housework, any of that. So now sharecropping or whatever you're doing in your community for work may not be sustainable because your children are helping. There were 8 Hurstons. Imagine them all going off to school. And when Zora's 15, she went to boarding school. And so what she was saying was, hey, she had the foresight to know that this integration practice was going to break down the community and erase black communities, which it did. And then we have secondhand shame, which was not as prevalent when you're growing up with your people. And don't get me wrong, because I think this is something that's hard to understand. Eatonville's a black town, but Maitland right next door. Like, Eatonville was really founded in large part because after enslavement was abolished, we had people like Joe Clark who founded Eatonville, and Mr. Tony, I can never remember his last name, but they were holding high official positions in Maitland. And the white neighbors, they said, look, y'all cool, we don't want to mess with y'all, but y'all got to get up out of our government. Start your own town, we'll help. And so they still did have relationship with neighbors who were white, but they still were able to have their community. And so Brown versus Board, what the Orlando Centennial published, did not capture the full statement that Zora put forth, which I had never been taught about. And I'm like, oh yeah, I could see how that would affect economy. And that was one of Zora's biggest struggles, because she was such a thinker and she thought so far down the road that where she was trying to meet people when she would get frustrated, and they would get frustrated with her. Because she had said, and that was misinterpreted, that Jim Crow works.
Oh yeah.
And so now we got Brown versus Board, her statement on the back of that.
I mean, Zora and the civil rights movement could be a whole series of classes in and of itself.
Yes.
But to add to what Ray said, when we think about our black elders who were not pro-integration, one thing we have to be very clear about is how we talk about them versus how we talk about white folks who were not pro-integration.
Yes.
So when we were doing this segregationist type of work, that was rooted in this idea of self-preservation, preserving our communities, preserving our heritage, preserving our languages, because we knew what was going to happen when we went into these predominantly white spaces. Self-segregation was rooted in keeping people separate because of this belief that one was inferior to another. And that's something that Dr. Ibram Kendi speaks about as well. How do we even come to understand this race crafting that's going on? So when we look at what happened during integration, to Ray's point, we lost a lot of our black teachers. A lot of them lost their jobs. And integration wasn't about having all the schools opened at the same time with black and white students. It was closing black schools and bringing black students into predominantly white environments that were often very dangerous for them, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And as someone who is a product of going to a near all-white school for high school, I was one of 3 black kids in my graduating class. So being in that environment, I can tell you there's some residuals from being there for the years that I was in that space. And thankfully, I had black parents who taught me at home so that I could go back into that space with that confidence. But there were times it was shaky. And so again, when we think about Zora's letter, she had concerns that we still have concerns about today, especially when we think of the legacy of integration and how we navigate that as community today.
Yeah, and even food sustainability. I'm sorry, that made me think about that, right? Because they left when you go into a different culture that doesn't live the way you do, Zora grew up with a 5-acre garden here, you know? So you don't know how to work the land. That's something that was lost. Yeah. Are you telling us to cut it,
No.
Christopher?
I was just saying, go to the last slide if you can.
Oh, okay. Do we want to play that last?
No.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. I think we could take one more question.
Yeah, she had her.
Oh, yeah. I like that. She's like, I'm going to get my question in, get it in. Yes.
I wanted her to get.
I'm from Kansas. I'm a KU grad, so rock
hey.
chop. I am raising a Zora, and I'm raising a Zora in a white space. I'm also an educator. I'm getting my PhD, and I'm looking at Zora as well. And I'm thinking about this concept of the Zora effect and how that affects Black girls. So I wrote down my question so it could be clear. I guess that's just the teacher in me. How do educators create spaces for Black girls to be just Black girls? Because it kind of piggybacks off what you were saying.
You want to take that? Y'all educators? Because I think it's the Black boys, too, based off of my son. Like, yeah. But the Black girls, how do educators do that?
I think educators, there's 4,000 things that can be done. But I think one of the most foundational things that educators have to do, first and foremost, and this isn't just educators, this is parents, this is community adults, this is the play auntie down the road. You have to treat children as equals. You cannot speak down to children. And so much of our teaching, especially when there's so much of our history that we're trying to instill in our children, we're trying to teach them about their past, as my parents did, that can be very overwhelming, overstimulating. So taking it a step at a time with them, sharing stories with them, and then talking to them and asking what do they think about it. Because if anyone's been around any 5-year-old for more than 5 minutes, you know they got stuff to say. And even again, if we're talking to young children, children understand the world around them in ways that adults, we often pretend we're not looking at, or we push that away because we gotta worry about rent and mortgages. But children give us so much when we listen to them. And so I would say as an educator, especially, that we have to do a better job at listening to children, because similar to Zora telling us, children will tell us exactly what's going on.
Yeah, and more homework, I will say, and then I'll let Christopher answer. Dr. Kendi is adapting 6 of Zora's works into children's literature. So Magnolia Flower was the first. Then we have Making of Butterflies. Barracoon just released on the 23rd, and that's for 8 to 12. I would say gift your Zora. Because I didn't know when I was growing up that there was someone like me. I was precocious. I had all of these ideas. And just like Zora's father tried to squelch it out of her, that's the experience that I had. And then Zora brought me back and was like, hey girl, let's do this inner child healing together. But if you can keep your child from deviating from that path of who she really is, it's gonna take her far. But stay prayed up and stay patient as a parent, because it's a lot.
I was just gonna quickly add that I think your question is spiritual work. I feel like it is like we're, I don't mean to be churchy, but we are coming against a lot of things that are really just mundanely created to tear us down, like it's just, here to not support us in a way. So even as they mentioned, like including literature, that's my answer as like an instructor, right? I want to include more literature that centers the lives of Black girls, Black women. Technically right now I'm teaching business communication, so that might be difficult, but I still include like readings that center, Black women and what they're doing in business and things like that. So I feel like just the mundane inclusion, just to see Black girls eating pie and in relationship, which is, I feel like, what Zora did with Their Eyes Are Watching God, right? Just to look at the inner life of Black women and people. I feel like that is really one of the first steps.
And I'll add one additional thing as well, this importance of reading together. But beyond that as well, so many of our children's stories now, like I wish I was 7 right now, because there are so many Black children's books. And as someone who's stepping into the space of Black children's storytelling as well, just seeing these books that are taking place in nature, magnolia flowers especially. So not only just reading the books, but then stepping and moving into those environments. So if there are ways that you can read outside, if there are ways for you to take them into nature, because that's one thing that Zora gave to me. I'm doing environmental history because of Zora. So I think if you can bring them into those spaces, move through that history with them as well, whether that's going to a history museum for a little field trip, or whether that's just going to the park and taking a few books out there for a picnic. That has ways that can move mountains and manifest magic that I'm still discovering with my inner child as an adult.
All right, let's give our panelists a round of applause, please.
We have one more note from the audience.
All right, one more. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Afia Zakia, and I wanted to just mention a reference by Leslie Fenwick, Jim Crow's Pink Slip. If you haven't heard of that book, it's one of the books that talks about the impact of teachers and the loss of Black teachers as a result of Brown versus Board of Education. So you might want to check that out.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, we thank our panelists for such a spirited discussion. I'm going to relinquish my post to Scott French, who will talk to us about what we can expect this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Trent. Thank you to the wonderful panelists, and thank you all for coming out this morning, and everyone online as well. I want to repeat that today's session and the two I'm about to describe were generously supported by the Florida Humanities, a grant from Florida Humanities. And so today, we are going to have a lunch break. That's not part of our conference, this schedule, but you got lucky because we're having a guest. Ibram Kendi is coming here from 12:15 to 1:15, and there will be a conversation. Julian Chambliss will be talking to Dr. Kendi, and I have just gotten the title for this. It's a very simple title, I believe. Oh, it didn't show up. Oh, here it is. It's a reading, a special reading of Barracoon. So stick around for that. I don't know if you knew that was happening, but don't go. That's a festival event that happens to fall in the middle of our event. We're going to return for the conference at 1:30 with Dr. Lonny Abbey Brooks, who is really doing fascinating work in virtual reality, developing the Mothership AI of an ancestral intelligence for the Astro-Equalitarian virtual nation from 2025 to 2050 while retaining our historic Black towns on the ground. So stick around for that. This is really mind-blowing, innovative work. 12:15 to 1:15 in this space. And then tomorrow you get a chance to take a walking tour with Ray Chesney at 10 o'clock. Meet here. And she has led these tours, and as she said, she visits Eatonville all the time. And so this is a great chance to continue the conversation, but also to learn from her and really hear a wonderful story that connects Zora's writings to this place. So we hope you'll come back tomorrow as well. I think that's all I have. We have surveys also. I know you're all sticking around because you want to be here for all of this, but please fill out a survey for this event as well. It's very helpful for us to get the feedback. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Association to Preserve the Eatonville Community, which is the presenter of the annual Zora Festival, I want to welcome you here. I'm N.Y. Nathiri, the Executive Director, and I've asked for this 30 seconds to say publicly how grateful we are that Dr. Ibram Kendi has gone out of his way to ensure that he would be able to come and give a talk at the 35th Annual Zora Festival. Dr. Kendi has been with us previously. Since that time, his star has risen exponentially, and it's very it's heartwarming to know that a celebrity scholar remembers those of us down in the trenches. So with that said, I just want to say, without being too smug and smart, but really we're grateful for your being here, for your commitment to the work. Thank you.
I'm going to turn this on. Oh, it's on. Okay. Thank you, NY, for those words of welcome. I'll add to those. My name is Julian Chambliss. I'm on the academics committee here for the Zora Neale Hurston Festival. I'm also one of the national planners, and I've been curating this Afrofuturist cycle. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation with you about your work. We do have some index cards for those of you who might want to ask some questions. We will hand those out, and if you have a question, we'll collect them and I'll look through them. Dr. Kendi has a very, very tight schedule, and I recognize that we don't necessarily run over. We have a very limited window here, and we have a keynote coming up after this. But I want to get into the conversation. Your name was mentioned quite a lot as we were having our morning sessions. There were a number of people who talked about the fact that you're adapting work from Zora Neale Hurston. And my first question actually sort of inspired by the implications of that work. I think one of the things that our panelists talked about is that Hurston's sort of commitment to education and the dangers sort of posed by desegregation are sort of misunderstood. And I think it's really interesting to sort of think about what you're doing and how your work is sort of directed toward young adult readers and what you think is important in the context of like producing this work for those readers at this time. Like, why is Zora Neale Hurston for a young adult so pivotal at this moment in our history?
Wow. Well, let me just first say I'm just truly honored to be here, to be on this land, to be in community with each of you. I'm so happy that the Zora Fest was able to allow me to be a part of this incredibly important gathering. And to your question, what you sort of mentioned about the concerns that Zora Neale Hurston had for desegregation, and I feel like I want to start there because in many ways my connection to Zora Neale Hurston, my original intellectual connection to Zora Neale Hurston was really trying to document how, particularly from the 1920s to the 1950s, she was a pivotal anti-racist voice, particularly not just in relation to white thinkers and scholars, but even some other black thinkers and scholars who she was challenging. And so in the case of certainly her speaking out against the potential pitfalls of desegregation, when other black intellectuals were just completely singing its sort of praises, to, of course, her saying to black writers that it is okay for us as artists to present black people imperfectly to white people, and if they see sort of negativity and quote unquote, that's their problem, not ours. And and everything in between. And I think in relation to our young people, I think one of the emerging conversations I think we're having as black folks today is around the construct of black excellence. And I mention this because I certainly think black folks should strive for excellence. All humans should strive for excellence. But at the same time, I think we should also strive to be willing to demonstrate, or I should say, we should not hide our imperfections. And I think particularly when you're talking to young people who like older people, are going to make mistakes. I think it's important to teach them to be okay with their imperfections. I also think it's important to teach them that they are not representatives of the race, that they are uniquely beautiful despite any sort of things that they may do differently, or the ways that they speak, or the ways that they express themselves, that they're fully human, they're just as equal as anyone else. And I'm mentioning all of this because I think presenting Zora Neale Hurston's work to young people, allowing our young people to see everyday Black folks in all of their humanity, not necessarily carefully constructed Black presentations for white people, but true and authentic presentations of Black folk for Black people, I think is, and others, I think is quite powerful.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I think that leads me to another question, because obviously we're in Florida, a place where the teaching of Black history and the Black experience is, let's say, under threat for neutral language, under attack, really demonized. And when you think about the story of Barracoon and what Hurston is doing and sort of interpreting that story for an audience, how can teachers sort of use the experience of this text to inform and build a capacity to understand slavery and the Black experience in a more comprehensive way? Like, what are some of the roadmaps that sort of like embedded in this work for you?
There are just so many, and that's why I think Barracoon, this adapted text is an excellent, and I guess I'm biased, but it's an excellent introduction to slavery and to the transatlantic human trade for young people. And not just because it is a life story, and kids learn best through stories, through personal stories, but then also there's so many different ideas within the text that actually confront or push back against circulating ideas currently about slavery. And so Cudjoe Lewis routinely states that he and others did not benefit from slavery in a whole bunch of different ways, right? Cudjoe Lewis expresses, like others, after emancipation, that he wants to go back to Africa. He did not imagine that things were better off for African people here in the United States because, quote, Africa was so barbaric. No, he wanted to return to his village. Cudjoe Lewis also, his story, even though most of the story was in enslavement, it didn't begin in slavery. The history of African Americans do not begin in slavery. And the history of slavery does not end with emancipation. And so, of course, it continues on in another form in Jim Crow, which, of course, Cudjoe Lewis's story also he also chronicles that part, in Barracoon. So that's just a few of the major lessons and ideas that I think this book pushes back, because I think we have to recognize that not only do we have to teach young people accurate ideas about slavery, we have to protect them from inaccurate ideas about slavery that are constantly circulating.
In many ways, one of the recurring themes always at the Zora Festival is what Zora has to teach us, that Zora is a pathfinder and a leader and a thinker. And I can't help but want to ask, when you think to yourself, I'm going to adapt her, what does that process look like? How do you approach the idea of, I'm going to take this work from this person who's in many ways ahead of her time, not given the sort of intellectual and cultural health she deserves, and and make it available to a new generation of readers to try to bring her brilliance to that readership. So like, can you talk a little bit about your adaptation and thinking about that process?
Well, I think, as a writer, I don't know of a better way to honor another writer than to adapt their work. So it's on a whole nother level of then reading, right? You really have to read it and understand it, and of course work with it to present it to a new set of readers or in a new form. And so for me, I don't know of a better way to honor and cherish and treasure, Zora's work. And so for me, I enter into the process from that standpoint. But I think this specific adaptation was quite unique because this story, Cudjoe's story, was in many cases, a painful story. Like this is, the story of being taken from your village and forced to march to the coast and being held in a prison, also known as a barracoon, for a while, and then forced on this ship, and then facing slavery, and then thinking slavery was over when the Civil War ended, only to be sort of thrust again into the slavery of Jim Crow. Like in many cases, it was a difficult, painful, at times traumatic story. So like, how would I tell this story to young people, to kids? And I have a 7-year-old daughter who, anytime we're watching a, quote, scary movie, she doesn't even want to come close to the TV, right? I mention that because I thought to myself, well, one of the interactions that Zora Neale Hurston documents in Barracoon is Cudjoe's interactions with his great-granddaughters. And this was an interaction in which he gives them peaches, in which he's constantly looking at them. You see that sugar cane? I planted that so I could give them some sugar. And, so he had this incredible affection, right, and love for his great-granddaughters. And so the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, how would he have told his story, even the painful moments, to these great-granddaughters who he dearly loved? What type of care and affection would he have had in telling that story? And so that's sort of the mind space that I put myself in. How do grandparents and great-grandparents, tell their stories, to tell about their lives to their grandchildren? And it's something that's done every day. And it's incredibly powerful because it's one of the earliest ways that young people learn history, right, through their grandparents. And that's a way in which I wanted young people, of course, reading this story to almost feel as if they're being told this story from one of their grandparents.
I appreciate that. I know it's odd, and especially here, I feel like the Zora Festival often brings people who know Zora backwards and forwards and are very familiar with their work.
Which is why I was like really nervous.
But at the same time, I am also always mindful that there are people who are like, I just didn't know as much about Zora until I came here, and now I'm really fascinated. So, and with that in mind, I'd ask you to sort of, if you would, in your own words, sort of describe Zora and where you would place this particular work within the body of her work in a way, right? Like, we know who Zora is, a towering figure, but I think every sort of towering figure, their work sort of speak to different moments and different ways that they're sort of evolving. So when you think about this particular work and you think about her body, her thinking over time, what would you want people to know about this in relation to that sort of epic story of her?
Sure. So I think among those who, of course, know about Zora, they mainly know about her through her novels. And fortunately, she is considered, as she should be, to be one of the greatest American novelists in history. But those of us who know Zora even more deeply know that she was one of the greatest folklorists in history, particularly through the books of folklore she collected. But those of us who know her even more deeply know that she was one of the greatest and most trailblazing anthropologists in history. And I think as it relates to her body of anthropological work, Barracoon stands in preeminence. And I just, the more that I studied the text in order to adapt it, the more I couldn't help but reflect on how she made such a difficult task easy, which is what the greats and the legends do, right? The incredibly difficult task of facilitating this man who's pushing 90 years old to trust her with the most intimate moments, of his life. The ability to record not only what he's saying, but how he's saying it. Like, it's already hard to record, right, what someone's saying, but then to record his language as well, to be able to convey that to the reader. And then thirdly, to be able to record, as great anthropologists do, her interaction with the subject in the text. And that was not just important from a scholarly standpoint, but even from a narrative standpoint. What happens in reading Barracoon, it almost, her interactions with Cudjoe almost serve as like interludes to his story, which I think allow a sort of a more captivating narrative pulse, because it's like not his story straight through. We're learning about the interactions or the sort of context in which he's telling the story, which to me adds to the sort of literary brilliance, of Barracoon. And so I just think this text, probably more than any other piece of work that she did, really demonstrates that she's a pioneering and legendary anthropologist.
And I also think one of the things that we almost always have to think about when we're adapting is like, what are the surprises? What are the sort of unexpected turns that are in the text, and how you navigate those? So when you think about this work and the job of it, adapting it, what are the moments that surprised you? What were some of the things that really stood out as important things for you to capture in a very particular way for the reader?
Well, the language, which I think was the hardest, because certainly it was incredibly important to me to preserve the language, because it was something that to me was an essential element of the text, but I also didn't want Zora coming out of her grave, if I did not, or any of you. So, but how to do that, right, was difficult, because I wanted to adapt a book in which young people could not only hear Cudjoe in the way that Zora wanted, but also read it, so simultaneously. And so as a result, I had to play around with letters and language and format, and so that was incredibly difficult, but hopefully I did it some justice.
Obviously, place is very important in the work of Hurston.
And do you mind if I give just one example?
Oh, sure.
So to give an example, one of the things, Cudjoe would oftentimes end words with E, and Zora would just basically just put the E at the end of the word. And so I was thinking, okay, how do I ensure that a child could both read the word and hear the E? And so, what I ultimately did was create a dash between the end of the word and the E, and just added another E. which then emphasized for the 10-year-old child the word and the sound with the E. It took a tremendous amount of time to get to that point, and it may sound simple, but it was incredibly hard, trying to figure that out.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, place. So I think one of the things I always think about when I think about Hurston is the question of place. Obviously she made Eatonville a sort of mystical, it's a real place, but almost mystical in the way that she describes it and shares it with so many people. This book introduces another important sort of black place, Africatown. And the book is dedicated to Africatown. Can you talk a little about that place and your sort of feelings and considerations of this sort of question of place and culture as you're thinking about the adaptation?
Well, I'm actually curious. If I had the opportunity to talk to Zora Neale Hurston about Barracoon, about Cudjoe Lewis, about Africatown, actually place would be one of the first questions that I would ask her, specifically around, because of her own personal life story and her connection to Eatonville, and Eatonville being such an historic place and space for independent Black sort of community building. Was that one of the reasons why she was attracted to and interested in learning about Africatown? And how Africatown came to be, and so that's one of the sort of questions that I would have for her, because obviously I think Africatown, like Eatonville, are such historic places of Black independence and Black power and Black cultural development. But I also think, as it relates to place, what's fascinating about Barracoon, and I'm hoping that young people see this, and I really tried to emphasize this, is that the story, the places of the story, the beginning and the end, are Africa and Africatown. And I just think that's quite beautiful.
I want to make sure I pay attention to the time. Okay, we're good. Just to sort of think about the story, there's a way where the traumas visited on Cudjoe are really vivid in the original text, and you're adapting those traumas for a young reader. Can you talk about how that experience opens the door to think about some of the contemporary traumas and dangers that children are navigating in regards to their everyday experience and the experience of people of color?
So I was, I think some people in adapting this book could have somehow just removed all the traumatic elements or sort of curbed them back so much that the child in reading Cudjoe's story would have never felt in any way close to what he felt. And I just thought I thought it was incredibly important to include as much sort of developmentally appropriate, sort of painful moments as possible, precisely because of what you'd stated, that if you're a young person, particularly a young Black person in this country, chances are you're navigating painful moments brought on by racism. Even at 7 years old, 10 years old, you even have 3- and 4-year-old children who are not being played with because of their skin color. And so if we don't expose children in a safe place, which is the book, to not just the painful moments, but the source of that pain, so they can realize that it's not them, Like what's happening to them is not because there's something wrong with them. And they can also see that other people are experiencing this too. And they can see the through line between slavery and racism. I think it's somewhat protective, if not liberating, and explanatory for children. And as we know, our young people are constantly trying to navigate, not just navigate, but figure out what's happening to them, particularly things that are uncomfortable. And so I think that's why including that was so important to me, in this text. And I think it's also the reason why it has been so enraging for me to witness people claim that they're trying to protect children from, quote, uncomfortable books or literature or conversations, because to me that is deeply harmful to the child. To not teach a child how to navigate, how to sit in discomfort is incredibly dangerous in a world where they're going to have to constantly navigate discomfort. But let me not go down that road.
I mean, this is the place to go down that road, but I hear you. Let's do something a lot lighter. This adaptation is accompanied by tremendous images and visuals. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with the artist, and what are some of the images that mean the most to you in terms of how you think they sort of extend the experience for the reader and for the audience a little bit?
So the image that caused me to want to work with Jasmine Lee Johnson, the artist, was an image that Jasmine calls smoke pictures. And this was an image that was inspired by a passage in Barracoon in which after Cudjoe shares with Zora about being taken from his village, and he's on this march to the African coast, and his captors more or less create a fire, and he's looking into the fire and the smoke that's coming from it, and picturing his family members that he's likely never going to see again. And in that moment, Zora narrates how she could tell that he was no longer there. He was no longer in Africa town. He, in a way, was back in Africa, truly looking at these pictures. And so she narrates how she got up to leave and left him with his, quote, smoke pictures. And so Jasmine created this portrait of Cudjoe Lewis with his smoke pictures, and you'll know it when you see it. If those of you haven't seen it, in the book, and it's just truly mesmerizing and powerful. And I think also, I really wanted to work with an artist who was going to really respect our young readers and develop a sophisticated, though clear, set of pictures that enhanced the narrative, but were layered in and of themselves, were stories within themselves, and that's certainly what Jasmine did.
Thank you. Again, I want to remind people, if you have questions, we have some index cards that are going to be floating around. We will gather those up. Okay, we don't have to use the index cards. If you want to ask your question directly, we can. All right. So get your questions ready. I do want to make sure I'm managing time. That's part of my job. But while we're doing that, I'm going to ask you one last question, because I think it's a good one. When you think about Zora's stories, whether it's nonfiction work or folk tales or novels, what do you think those stories have to say to today's children about America and its history? And I would add on, like, the future a little bit, because I always think when you read Zora Neale Hurston, you learn a little bit about the future. That's my own personal opinion. But.
Wow. I mean, there's so many things, but one thing I will, I'll just emphasize, because I just think I think it's just important for us to continue to return to this, is that in certain types of ways where we are in the midst of a literary period in which a number of writers, particularly writers of color, women writers, queer writers, working class writers, Jewish writers, Muslim writers, writers from all sorts of groups that historically have been asked to assimilate, into sort of dominant cultural forms, in which those writers are boldly and unapologetically creating characters and stories based on everyday people. Based on everyday people who they've interacted with. And so they're not necessarily seeking to create characters to persuade other groups that have historically looked down on their own group that there's nothing inferior about them. They don't care about that, right? They just want to create authentic characters. And I'm mentioning this because there was a time in which this was unheard of. And that was throughout Zora Neale Hurston's writing career. So it just goes to show how far ahead of her time she was when she was writing, which is precisely why so many of her contemporaries were deeply critical of her work. And because particularly you had Black writers who they were writing through the white gaze. And she was like, forget the white gaze, right? And it was unthinkable for other writers like Richard Wright to not write through the white gaze. And I think, again, we're living in a time in which writers are not doing that. Women writers are not writing through the male gaze, and working class writers are not writing through the elite gaze. And I'm mentioning because it's not just about race, right? She inspired so many other writers and creators and intellectuals. And I just think that this literature, which to me was inspired by Zora Neale Hurston, is so critical to us revolutionizing this world.
Okay, well, people did the index card thing, so we're gonna use the index card. All right. This is a good one. Can you speak a little bit more about adaptation in general and how it might be a tool towards realizing an Afrofuturist vision?
Wow.
Pretty good, right?
So I think that if we think of an adaptation from the standpoint of the writer who created the original work, an adaptation allows that writer's work to stand in the future. Like, just at sort of a basic way. There's no way in which I could have written and adapted Barracoon from the standpoint of 1931. I just don't, I didn't live in 1931. I could have, the only way in which I was going to adapt it is from the standpoint of 2024, using the language and idioms and perspectives that we've accumulated over the course of, the last 80 years. And I'm mentioning that because I think in certain types of ways, adaptations are fundamentally futuristic, which I never really thought about, until this question.
All right, then. We've added something to the toolkit. Then.
Yes.
This is another great question, and I think we kind of know the answer, but it's helpful to know more. You've adapted other Zora works. What's your plan in this adaptation of Zora vein? Like, where do you see yourself going in the future related to this, or are we at the end of this project from your perspective?
So when I ended up working with Zora Neale Hurston's estate and trust, we agreed that I would adapt 6 books in total, 6 children's books based on Zora's work, and so Barracoon is the 3rd, and a 4th is coming, and the 4th is a picture book that's based on a passage, or I should say a chapter in Zora Neale Hurston's autobiography, and that picture book is called Eatonville. Don't tell nobody, though.
That is the best news ever. Tell us more. No.
Well, I mean, it's for those who have read Zora Neale Hurston's autobiography. I don't know if you remember that early in the book, she narrates how Eatonville came to be, and so the adaptation is a picture book for children on how Eatonville came to be.
Awesome. This is a question that I think is important. It's probably something that all teachers are wrestling with. We have someone else asking about Huck Finn and teaching that. And I do think it kind of relates, and I think it's worthwhile given your thinking about these things. You know, for teachers in the landscape that we're in today, not just simply in Florida, I would argue that there's a real sort of war on education, especially when it comes to the question of race and history, that's very profound. How do you handle trying to do that work in the context of the pressure you're under? And how can some of these classic texts that are in the canon that sort of fit, that are telling these stories from a particular perspective, how can they be adjusted to tell a more realistic story, to tell a story that's more grounded in trying to understand the truth of the past?
So, I wrote this history of anti-Black racist ideas called Stamped from the Beginning, and for that book, I had to read a number of the most racist texts that have ever been created about Black people. And I'm mentioning that because if I was to, there are 2 ways to teach a younger person or older person about, let's say, racist and anti-racist ideas. One is to introduce them to an anti-racist novel, right? One of Zora's novels. Another is to introduce them to a racist novel and talk about it and demonstrate and show how certain passages are what's wrong, what's problematic, or what's racist or sexist, or about these specific passages. So that allows, it almost becomes a baseline for allowing the child to figure out what is problematic. And I'm mentioning that because I think no matter the text, whether racist or anti-racist ideas, it can serve as a teaching tool. And obviously, I think it's important for educators to have the freedom to select the texts that they think are best for their students, which is part of a larger problem. But But even if we're forced to, as many teachers in this state were forced to for 100 years, teach from racist texts, we can also demonstrate to students why those texts are racist. And I mention that because obviously what teachers are being faced with now in Florida and other states where anti-racist books are being banned or censored is precisely what Florida teachers, particularly black teachers, were facing from up until 1970, if not more recently. And so those teachers still found ways to ensure that their students understood a more accurate view of history, even though the social studies texts they were mandated to teach were teaching a distorted racist view. How did they do that? They brought in materials clandestinely, from other writers. There's this book called Fugitive Pedagogy by Jarvis Gibbons, and he opens the book with this anecdote about this black teacher who was reading from one of Carter G. Woodson's books in her class, a book that was banned in that district. And so then when the principal walks into the class, she also had another book, the approved book, right there. And so she just flipped it, right, and acted like she was teaching from the approved book, right? And then when the principal left, she went back to Carter G. Woodson. Now, obviously, she was risking her job, she was risking her career, but again, this was a normal practice, particularly for black teachers, for decades, willing to, and in many ways, it was a normal practice for teachers even before this recent sort of scourge of book banning, because if they weren't facing it, let's say, from the state or from public officials or from trolls online, in certain cases, they faced it from parents, right? In other cases, they faced it from fellow teachers, but they still, pushed on. And fortunately, many teachers are still doing that today.
Thank you. I will say, since he said it's okay, if you have a question, you raise your hand.
We have one from the webinar.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
One from the webinar. I'll repeat it.
All right.
Oh, you can say it.
I'm going to let you read it, actually.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, I get to read it from the webinar. Okay. While a phenomenal book, does Barracoon unintentionally, and movies like The Woman King, freeze African history in a particular moment that can negatively distort the long view and breadth of African history and experiences? Distort the long view, genealogy, and breadth of African history and experience.
So in Barracoon, adapted for young readers, it's it has an introduction, and in that introduction, I attempt to prevent that sort of negative distortion of African people at that time. And so, to give an example, in that introduction, I talk about that the common view that I think many people have that, quote, black people sold themselves is actually not historically accurate. And what I mean by that is when, let's say, the Dahomey nation, which is the nation that ultimately captured and kidnapped Cudjoe, were capturing and kidnapping people, they were not capturing and kidnapping their people. They were not capturing and kidnapping people that they considered to be their people. There were multiple ethnic groups There were multiple language. There were multiple religions. The notion that all, quote, the people in Africa were one people, one black people, was an idea that, of course, was circulating in Europe and other places, but that's not necessarily the case that the people there were believing it themselves. And so, in other words, I think that our current 21st century conceptions of race and all black people, no matter the languages they speak, the ethnic groups they come from, the cultures that they practice, being one people, imposing that onto the 19th century, onto the people who did not think of that as such, to me is flawed. And so I think that's the first thing. The other thing I tried to document in the text is that there were multiple nations. I should say there were multiple types of relationships to the trade. And so there were nations like the Homie that decided to build their own economy based on the human trading. But then there were other nations who decided to not participate in the trade at all. And then there were other nations who decided to only trade to acquire guns to protect their nation from traders like the Dahomey. But the nations that decided to not engage in the trade, they were quite vulnerable. Because what happened was nations like the Homie, they were able to grow wealthy and develop a level of military power that allowed them to, as Cudjoe Lewis sort of documents, be able to wage successful wars against these other nations and, of course, sell the captives. So it put those other nations, those other communities in a very difficult situation. And scholars like Walter Rodney have written about this. In other words, like, what do you do? If you don't participate in the trade, you make your people more likely to be kidnapped. If you do participate in the trade, you're engaging in a moral sort of wrong. So what do you do? And there were a number of different responses that communities have, and I tried to talk about that, again, in a developmentally appropriate way, for young people. And so I tried to add some context, to that. I also tried to talk about the relationship that European demand played in nations like the Homie supplying the demand, and of course, in the ways in which European demand on the coast transformed the conditions in the interior, which is to say, if there was not that demand, those conditions would not have been transformed in which more people engaged in the trade. And so I think it's a complicated thing, but I do think that it's important for us to talk about it and for us to complicate it. And hopefully we can even complicate it when we're talking to our children, about it. But hopefully people begin to do away with this sort of ahistorical idea that, quote, African people sold themselves. Like, black people are not even a monolith today, even with conceptions that we're all the same. Black people are, I don't do those black folks in Jacksonville. Like, it's, I mean, so imagine, right, without those conceptions. And it's the same thing for your, white folks. It's the same thing for Asian folks. So it is, to me, but I should also add that idea is used by the apologists of slavery. As I've been talking about Barracoon on social media, I can't tell you how many people who have been stating the most racist things about DEI or about, quote, so-called wokeism are also saying, oh, well, the problem is y'all sold yourselves and y'all don't want to talk about that. Because, of course, that's the racist idea that black people are the problem, and we always are. Even as it relates to the transatlantic trade, we're still the problem, according to racist thinkers.
Another question that is a little broad, but I think what you just said kind of touches on it. Hurston's work as a anthropologist, as someone who does oral history, who really studied the sort of cultural contributions that African Americans have made, really stands as a constant, I think, source of inspiration for a lot of scholars. So when you think about Hurston as a figure, what's her impact on culture right now? Like, how is she part of the cultural conversation, or should she be a part of the cultural conversation? Which I think is always one of the things that comes up at the festival. More people should know about Hurston. More people should be reading Hurston. So from your perspective, what should we be doing? How should we think about Hurston in that cultural conversation of the day?
Well, it's as I think everyone knows, the more people know about any historical figure, the more other people have the ability to misrepresent that person for their own political and cultural ends. And so there's always a downside of, of someone like Zora Neale Hurston being as well known as a Martin Luther King Jr. Y'all see what's happening to King. Apparently he was this sort of colorblind pacifist who just wanted us all to get along. And I'm mentioning that because I of course would like more and more people to seriously engage with her work, which is one of the reasons why I personally decided to adapt these books for young people, because I'm hoping that if we're introduced to Zora's work earlier, that the questions and the curiosity that we'll have for Zora Neale Hurston will start earlier, and that curiosity will then lead to a deeper engagement, with her work, which I think is the best place and space, which is to me the best for not only Zora but also the culture. But I also think that in many ways the flowering of African American culture, and what I mean by flowering, the culture of African Americans sort of spreading around the world and impacting cultures, around the world. I don't think we owe enough gratitude and debt to those who preserved that culture, like Zora Neale Hurston. I mean, in terms of preservationists, there were few writers in particular who were as pivotal and has been as pivotal, as Zora Neale Hurston. And so I think for me, that's one of the areas in which I would hope that she would ultimately get her due.
Thank you. Well, we're coming up to the last few minutes of our conversation. And there's a question I always like to ask people when I'm interviewing them, especially when they have a project out, and it has to do with, is there a thing that you want to be asked, but no one asks you? Because when you're doing interviews for stuff, people always ask. But then I always find that when you worked on something for a long time, you've thought really hard about it, there's this question, for whatever reason, that you want to be asked, but for some reason, interviewers never get to ask that question. They never think that question. So I always ask the person with the project, hey, is there a question that you want to be asked that you haven't been asked? What? It's a legitimate question.
Let's see, should I give myself a softball question or?
It's your time, man.
I mean, I think that I think one question that I probably am not asked enough or haven't really been asked is about why it is so critically important to teach the youngest of kids about slavery. And I think even more specifically, how can young kids benefit from learning about the history of slavery in a more sort of accurate and complex way earlier? You know, I think that to me was one of my major reasons for adapting this specific book, as I mentioned earlier. But I also think that I don't think we Americans understand how much of a disservice we do to young people in relation to teaching about slavery. And just to give probably two major examples, in South Africa, young children are taught about apartheid, very young children. And it's clear as day as to why it's important to teach the youngest of children about apartheid. Because studies show that as early as 3 years old, our kids start internalizing what we now understand as racist ideas. And so it's critically important for us to begin to teach them as they're internalizing those ideas are wrong, and teach them a different set of ideas. Of course, Germany begins teaching about the Holocaust in kindergarten and teaches all the way up. And it's mandated and required, you know, for every German child, you know, to learn expansively, you know, about the Holocaust. And of course, the teaching changes with each year based on what's developmentally appropriate, but it's mandated. But in the United States, you know, our young people could go all of elementary school while only reading 5 paragraphs about slavery the whole time. And so to me, it's just an incredible tragedy, particularly in relation to what other countries, you know, are doing that have these documented, you know, forms. And of course, depending on historians, some historians will say that apartheid lasted about 40 years. Others will say it lasted nearly a century. You know, of course, we know the Holocaust lasted during World War II, but slavery lasted for nearly 250 years on this land.
Well, see, it was a good question. I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule and sharing about this work and sharing about your love of Zora. This is an audience that loves Zora, and you're probably right now at the top of the list of, especially with this Eatonville. I mean, man, we're so excited about this. So when's that going to come out? It's going to be the next question you're going to be dogging you with online. But again, thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause. I really appreciate it. Obviously, it's always great to see you, and your support of the festival is very meaningful. So thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. We're about to start our final session of the day. My name is Julian Chambliss. I'm a professor at Michigan State University. I'm also on the academics committee here for the festival. And it's my honor to introduce the keynote for this last session, Dr. Lonny J. Ivy Brooks. Dr. Brooks is an associate professor of communication at California State University in East Bay. As the principal co-investigator of the long-term and future thinking and education project, he has piloted the integration of future thinking into communications curriculum around the country. As a leading voice in Afrofuturism, Brooks has contributed numerous articles, journal articles, chapters, participated in exhibitions about Afrofuturism and its meaning. He is a sort of leading member of the Black Speculative Arts Movement, which is one of the leading sort of groups that is championing Afrofuturism around the world. As we were thinking about the end of this cycle and thinking about space as a goal, he immediately came to mind as someone who's able to talk about not just simply physical space, but actually mystical space or virtual space, as you will see in his presentation. As is the case with all of our presentations, this is possible by the generous support of the Florida Humanities Council grant, and we appreciate their support for our speakers and for our educational programming today and throughout the festival. Dr. Brooks's presentation he wins the award for the longest title of the presentation, by the way. Developing the Mothership AI of Ancestral Intelligence for the Astro-Equalitarian Virtual Nation from 2025 to 2020, while retaining 2050, while retaining our historic Black towns on the ground. Whew. So, it's my honor to welcome Lonny Brooks to the Zora Neale Hurston Festival for the first time, perhaps not for the last time. I feel like he likes it here. He might be coming back. So, Lonny.
Thanks so much, Julian, for having me here and for welcoming me. Yes, so let me start right off. I also belong to a company, I co-founded a company called the Afro-Rhythm Futures Group, and we co-created a game called the Afro-Rhythms from the Future. So it's kind of embedded in what we're doing, too, to envision the future. And I'll get more to that. But my teammates who are usually here to talk with me aren't here today, but Ahmed Best is part of our group, co-founder, and also Jade Fabello. So Ahmed Best, you might know as he played Jar Jar Binks in Star Wars, so I'll just say that. And he was in the third season of Mandalorian as a new Jedi who saves Baby Yoda. So yeah, he's a successful, actor, writer, producer based in Los Angeles. He's a great human being, and he's very much here in the presence of this talk and conversation. So I just want to acknowledge him and Jade Fabello as well. So I want to kind of, the term Afrofuturism surfaces up, but I want to, maybe expand upon it just to refresh our memory about what it is about, too, as a launching point to what we're creating in terms of what we call the Astro-Equalitarian Virtual Nation, that can help envision what Edenville might be in the future, too, as a safe space. So I'm going to ask you to join me on this Afrofuturism journey. Going from algorithms of oppression to Afro-rhythms of liberation. So you take Afro, you combine it with rhythm from algorithm, you get an Afro-rhythm. So how do we reinvent the algorithms that surround us on our phones and reinvent them as Afro-rhythms of liberation? So going forward, I always like to acknowledge that I come from California in the East Bay, on the sacred land of the Lonny peoples. A little bit about my background, because it's a part of my identity. I'm Black, I'm Jewish, I'm Native American. I've been oppressed for 3,000 years. All right, so, but I take that seriously. These are some of my cousins, the Coitecans of Nuevo Leon in Mexico. So, we all, a great painting by my brother Naomi Brown in Oakland. He has this painting that it'll be in these slides, but it says, "What's your Black?" And as Ibram Kendi told us, being Black isn't monolithic. So it's like, what's your Black? What's your Black? So we all have these varieties of the Black experience that I love and cherish. My daughter is like Filipina and Black and Jewish and some more, you know? So it's like, you know, and she's discovering what her blackness is. So I love it. Anyway, but you know, Native Americans and indigenous peoples, like some people think that they're not around anymore, or that like we're just iconic peoples hung on a wall in these images, but we're still here. You know, that's why I love this image. I always put it up here too. But going forward, I just want to give you a kind of a tour of some of my favorite images and explain this idea of the rise of astro-blackness. So on this left side is this image of a black mind expanding in multicolored hues, created by Mansell Bowman for the exhibition of Unveiling Visions, the Alchemy of the Black Imagination, that took place in the Black Center for Black Studies in New York City in 2013. And this is a really special image because it just kind of juxtaposes with the images of black people that we might see in everyday life in terms of the brutality of the police against us. But I love this kind of reversal of that image. And in the middle, it's this really fantastic image by Katana Wynn, reimagining the mothership, you know, from Parliament Funkadelic. But the mothership that I interpret is what I call our ancestral intelligence, the real AI, that we can gain sustenance from our past and amplify it into the future. So this particular image by Katana Wynn, who's based in the Bay Area, is called And Suddenly Froze. There's a good story behind that. This other image is a series of images that were in Oakland, put up in Oakland, across the street from this augmented reality lab that I was a part of, that was really important to me in being part of this augmented lab, and it was called Dynamic Land. It was trying to envision the future of the library, but in community computing in general. Across the street, Tarika Lewis, the former artist and leader of the Black Panther Party, was putting up these images right about the same time, just after the Black Panther film came out. And she says, "Welcome to Panther territory. I wish this were a Marvel fantasy." You know, and it was really profound to me because as she was putting out these images, we were creating the game, the Afro Rhythms from the Future game, at that augmented reality space called Dynamic Land. So pretty profound to me as a good omen of what was to come. These are some other images. You know, I wish this were a Marvel fantasy. Beautiful, beautiful images. I'm glad I took pictures of them because like after a month and a half, they were gone, right? It was a temporary installation. But the rise of astro-blackness is about a person's black state of consciousness that can be released from the confining and crippling slave or colonial mentality, who becomes aware of the multitude and varied possibilities and probabilities of the universe. And this is from the Reverend Andrew Rollins, who used to be a reverend at the Baptist ministry in Oakland. So when we think about that, the rise of astro-blackness, we can think about, and I get this inspired by Alice Walker too, we can re-narrativize our tale of coming to America, of coming to the Americas as a science fiction horror story. So imagine that we're from the planet of West Africa, and with the latest in bondage technologies, we're taken across a vast interstellar sea. And once we arrive at the Americas, we could be killed for speaking our language, practicing our religion, eating our food. At that moment of a total erasure, or even playing our music, we had to reinvent ourselves. We had to become hybrid futurists in a hostile territory, to the point where, you know, women and men hid seeds right in their hair to sprout seeds upon arrival, right, to create our food, to create new forms of language. So Black people have always been futurists because we had to be. With the onslaught of colonialism in Africa, the onslaught of colonialism and slavery here in America. So Afrofuturism aims to reclaim and transform the trauma of past atrocities against the Black and Afro-queer diaspora. That's what I'm about. Now, with the imposition of Christian hymnals and Christianity upon our peoples, what do? We took those hymnals, we transformed them into what scholars call sonic utopias, spirituals that envisioned lands without slavery. And spirituals talk about liberation, sustainability in our future scenarios that go on to become the other future scenarios of jazz and hip hop and house music and rock and roll, R&B, hip hop, and to the point that every genre on the planet is infused with Black soul and Black visions of the future. You know, I just remember an acquaintance of mine on my dorm at UCLA saying, "Oh, hip hop, well, that's just a trend, right? That's just a fading fad, fading fad." I'm like, uh-huh. So when we think about that, we think about movements like the Black Speculative Arts movement that have been created to celebrate the Black imagination, that it's global, it's worldwide now. It started in America in the United States as an annual festival. It's quickly picked up by Canada. It's being readapted in African countries like South Africa, Kenya, Cameroon, Nigeria. It's the biggest growing chapter of it is in Sao Paulo in Brazil. I was just there. Afrofuturism is emerging and being adapted to the local cultures and context. The African continent and the African peoples there are readapting it to Afrofuturism 3.0. It's going to become something different. But I think, as we talked about, like African futurism, Afrofuturism, our language, the English language, has a hard time imagining the future itself. So let us sprout a million different terms about Afrofuturism and African futurism in any variety of Black and Indigenous futurisms. So there is Indigenous futurism, there is queer futurism. It's time to enrich our language with the language of the future. So when we think about Black people as being futurists, we can go back to the Congo Cosmogram, this great image by Natrice Gaskins, who's an AI, artificial intelligence artist, where we look at Inseke, which is the world of the living that meets the world of our ancestors in Pemba, and in the middle are the Kalunga lines, where all possibilities of the future become possible and emerge. So the Kalunga lines are where our ancestors meet us in the present to create the future. So we have indeed always been futurists. W.B. Du Bois, his work as a science fiction writer was rediscovered by another member of our network, Sheree Renee Thomas, who talks about that he was not just a sociologist of African American life, he was a science fiction writer. And so what did he do? Well, in his novels, in the Princess Still novels in early 1900s, 1908 to 1910, he invents this hypothetical machine called the megascope. Now, John Jennings in our network has also created this as a comic book imprint now. It's its own series. But the megascope is about finding our undiscovered stories, the undiscovered stories that we're discovering about Eatonville, right? Through Zora and through emerging stories of what's been happening in the recent past. So I came up with this term because I was trying to capture something here called Afrofuture types or Afrofutotopes. Like radioactive isotopes we can trace across times, Afrofuture types or Afrofutotopes are Black signals of the future that find and reclaim the traces of Black cultural visions alongside the erasures of those signals. Now, how many of you have heard about, hidden signals, or hidden figures, that is? The movie about those women, Black mathematicians, engineers, computer scientists at NASA during the 60s that were helping to chart the trajectory of white astronauts into space. Now, I don't know about you, I only heard about that in the last 5 years. But this is an example of an ascendant Black vision, a Black feminist vision at that had become nearly erased until someone had turned it into a book that became adapted into a film. That's an example of simultaneous erasure and simultaneous ascendant vision, right? Eatonville is an example of that signal, that Afrofuturotope, where we are discovering these stories and rediscovering even richer stories of its past and now its future. So Afrofuturism, in essence, and I'd just like to remind us of what this is, combines science fiction and fantasy to re-examine how the future is currently imagined and to envision alternative futures based on the Black experience. Now, to visualize alternative memories of the future is kind of enabling us to create what Jake Dunnigan, a noted futurist based in Austin from the Institute for the Future, he calls them cognitive prosthetics. See, we have this ability, they're like muscles in our brain, neurons in our brain that can grow the future. So in the same spot, and MRI studies have confirmed this, in the same spot that we have memory, we also have the future is formed in the same spot in our minds, in our brains. So when we look out in front of us, we actually imagine more than what's there. This was an adaptive trait for our species as humans. So we can create alternative memories of the future that can actually heal us. That's why Zora, responds to our minds, because we are imagining alternative futures through her work, reimagining the past into the future. We can create experiential futures to heal ourselves and to heal others. I love this image by Latrice Gaskins, too, who uses artificial intelligence like Midjourney and others in her own art to project images of Black celebrities and leaders. So I share a dream to ensure that long oppressed racial minority and diverse voices can articulate themselves in the futures imagined and in the practices of long-term thinking and in the professional areas of foresight. That's how I am a futurist, and an Afrofuturist, celebrating the Black imagination. Now, I think it's really momentous that we're in the Dayton Johnson Community Center here because I co-founded a community future school based in the Museum of Children's Arts in downtown Oakland, with Nina Woodruff Walker, who's the director of MOCA, the executive director of MOCA, and we teach cohorts of high school students in 11th and 12th grade to think about the future more intentionally, to think about Afrofuturism, queer futurism, indigenous futurism. We have a wide variety of students that are Black, Latino, from Yemen, that we say that, as Ibram Kendi was talking about, that your ancestry, your family identity matters, that you are signals of the future. So we want to use Afro rhythms from the future to heal, to create alternative memories of the future, to see more and to rise into that astro-Blackness potential. So these are some mid-journey images I created when I put it in Community Future School, and this is what I came up with. Actually, this is one image of it looks just like one of our students, Elise Brown, who's now a game studies major and computer science major at UC Santa Cruz. But she created what she called an ancestral bracelet, too. That's me. We'll get more into this, but that's my character in 2045 as a holographic shaman. We'll talk about that. I was fooling around with Midjourney. This is our game. It's all going to come together, too, but this is our game called Afro Rhythms from the Future. We center Africana peoples and indigenous peoples in the future. It's an imagination card game, and these are the variety of cards that we use. Tension cards. We're going to actually try to play a little bit of this if we have time, too, but we'll go into that. But that's what they look like. Alan Clark actually created the logo for us of these cards, and so really amazing work. But this is the ancestral bracelet that Elise Brown created, where we can, by touching this bracelet, you get in touch with your ancestors. Like maybe it's Zora or an ancestral inspiration that you like. And she can remind you of who you are and what you're about and coach you, as you're going forward. So I just love her inventiveness in this and creating this ancestral bracelet. It came out of our game. This is one example of another object where you take an inspiration card, you combine it with an object card, you smash it together with another idea like social justice. So we came up with walking with Angela Davis shoes. So you take a mundane object like shoes, and you put it with Angela Davis as an inspiration, and as you put on these shoes, up pops a holographic projection of herself, narrating you through her experience as a member of the Communist Party and as an ally with the Black Panther Party. So there's also an image by Alan Clark, too. So when we talk about the metaverse, it looks like, Facebook's founder created it, the term, Mark Zuckerberg as the metaverse, or now Meta, right? It's like, I claim colonial ownership over all of this space. We came up with that first. Well, actually, Neale Stephenson, coined this term in his novel, Snow Crash. And it was dystopic in 1992. But there's another African scholar, Zeleny Kato, that talked about a pluriverse. How could we have a pluriverse that was liberating and inclusive and accepting of everyone and liberating? So I like to call the metaverse the pluriverse. Reverse this language, create new language about it. So we have teamed up. The Afro-Rhythm Futures Group is collaborating with a virtual reality company called Origami Air. And with them, we created a town that always takes place 8 years in the future. We came in late, so we are adding our bit to it. It's called Afterville, and it was on the AltSpace VR platform by Microsoft. That was shut down. Now it's migrated to a new virtual reality platform called VR Chat. But Afterville takes place in the Pacific Northwest. It has a deep history where the U.S. has sort of evolved and broken up into different regions. So this is part of the Pacific Union region. So it's a rich history of that. So when I thought about Afterville, it's like one of the richest places and spaces that you can walk through. Amazing programmers at Origami Air that have helped us and invited us to create our own version of Afrofuturism in this virtual reality space. They gave us, they launched ships, they launched projects in ships, like air balloons, I'm blanking on the name for that. But they gave us our own ship called the Air Afro-Rhythm. We dubbed it the Air Afro-Rhythms ship. And we had a discussion about what that would look like. And so, I'm going to go forward here. So in June of 2022, we decided to create a whole kind of mythical backdrop to Afro-Rhythms as well. I'm creating and co-creating a graphic novel about this, and this is where I feel like Eatonville is definitely embedded in this story. So for Juneteenth of 2022, we called in the Mothership. We call it Mothership AI, too. And so we had a whole game that we did around it. We had to find different gems and put them together to call in the Mothership as an ancestral figure and inspiration to guide us into the future. So this is a little bit of how we did it. When we put the James together, a great music producer created this soundscape for us. So the Mothership, imagine the Mothership is arriving above us, with us, and we're dancing to welcome her arrival. And she's coming towards our ship. She's coming towards Earth. She's coming towards the Afro-Rhythm, Afro-Rhythm ship. I usually don't play it for this long, but I like the music. With you, I feel like I can play the full thing. We can kind of move into it. But that's our air Afro-Rhythm ship, and that's the Mothership coming towards us. And it was really great. I mean, like, we could actually, in that event, we actually saw the Mothership coming towards us in virtual reality. So this was the basis for creating the Astro-Equalitarian Virtual Nation, what we call AVEN. And that's my avatar. That's a really early version of my avatar. It's evolved now. And if you notice, in alt space VR, you cannot have legs. But in VR chat, you can have a fully embodied avatar. Avatars are important because the avatar space is so taken up by other people's versions of what we are that we actually need to invent our own avatars as symbolic representations of ourselves in virtual reality, to have our second self. Sherry Turkle in the late 80s, an MIT professor, wrote a book called Computers as a Second Self. It was really prolific or prophetic in that sense, that we as Black people need to create our own avatars. As earthling cultures, as earthlings and humans on this earth, we need to create our own avatars before they're kind of commercialized and taken over by that space. We have the power to do so now. So we'll talk about that. That was actually going to take. Well, that's the entrance to our air Afro-Rhythm ships. And if you go forward, that's Name Brown. We actually did an exhibition of his work on the Afro-Rhythm ship. And that's some of the first panels of the comics that we're putting in. The whole idea of this space, of the Pluriverse space, is to create a platform for our stories in multimedia, in various media. And not only that, since most of the world does not have access to VR, how do we create satellites of VR through various forms? So if you were part of the Astro-Egalitarian Virtual Nation, how could you experience this nation without being in VR? Maybe it's through a comic book. Maybe it's through music. Maybe it's through different other ways of accessing, through our game, through other games. So that's a part. How do people experience this virtual nation non-virtually as well? So we translated our game into virtual reality aboard our ship as well. That's Ahmed's avatar in the green cap. And as we did this, we actually created, we adapted part of an African game to this as well. And that's one of Name Brown's paintings, What's Your Black? So he has these Afrofuturist figures, and they're all looking at different screens and saying, what's your black? What's your black? I went to Brazil recently to play the game, Afro-Rhythms for the Future in Brasilia, and man, they don't care if they speak English or not. It's all Portuguese, right? So their experience of being blackness and being Black in Brazil is just mind-blowing, right? Because many slaves, also in Colombia, not only were kidnapped, but they got freed from shipwrecks. And they had to retreat in the jungle to protect themselves and created alliances with indigenous peoples. And so that created a whole other culture, right? A whole other hybrid culture of what being Black is. So it's so rich. Latin America and Brazil is like an alternative universe of Blackness. So this is the earlier phrasing of AVEN, but it's a union of African and indigenous diasporans claiming Black space in the virtual pluriverse. So this is what we call our sandbox room, where we create and imagine what that future of AVEN could be. And so part of this is also based in storytelling. So when we think about Edenville and thinking about the stories of there, I was inspired by these historical Black towns that were simultaneously faced erasure, right, across our country. Especially, in Oklahoma, with the Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa. So imagine a former village founded by ex-slaves was just discovered by the indigenous territory of Afterville, and is tied to the prosperous Black community of the city Windsor Hills in Cascadia near Afterville. Their descendants are part of a circle of ancestral wisdom and ancestral seers and librarians. What was also discovered was a quilt blanket with clearly delineated African fractal textiles that depicted otherworldly cities that archaeologists are analyzing and deciphering their meaning. A photo was found, not of this world or Earth. So I was really inspired. I'm really inspired by the Dogon tribe of Mali, who imagined themselves as being from the Sirius B star system. Or they imagine a group of beings from that system that taught them about their knowledge. So I was just inspired to create this story. Well, what if you had a mothership world, from this area, their star blew up, and they had to readapt and find another planet to live on, and they'd come to Earth. And instead of that whole colonial tales and science fiction of we conquer you, we take you over, no, they had to learn from African tribes. The African tribes told them how to adapt to Earth too, and they, in a peaceful manner, hybridized their knowledge with us through African textiles. The African textiles unveiled the mothership civilization as well. So I like to combine these mythic tales. The Sirius B star system, you can't see with the naked eye. So something's going on. We don't know what it is. I'm just saying. All right. So that's part of creating this tales, this richer amplification of our earthbound tales to the space. We are kind of intergalactic Afrofuturist, right? So I was telling that tale as part of an annual event in Afterville called The Ghost of Afterville. And also, we can think of other historic villages of escaped slaves and indigenous peoples found in the hills of the Cascadia Forest beyond Afterville. So in Afterville, we're creating this kind of rich narratives that are invoking spaces like Eatonville, inspired by the tribe of Dogon, and reimagining them. So in Afterville, we have a community center as well that has an archive of what we're doing. And it's part of the tale that we're telling about how AVEN has been formed, the Astro-Equalitarian Virtual Nation. But we're bringing our students into virtual reality as well, and our staff at the Museum of Children's Arts. And how we're doing that is that we're working with the programmers at Origami Air, and we're creating new spaces. One of the spaces that we came up with at a retreat recently last summer was called Carver Farm. And it's part of this game, this live-action role-playing game that we'll be playing as part of the UN Summit of the Future that's next year. It was kicked off in September, and we're going to be playing it in conjunction with the UN Summit of the Future. That UN Summit of the Future is trying to imagine what would it mean to have a Ministry of the Future, like Kim Stanley Robinson, a science fiction writer, has recently created a work called Ministry of the Future. So he's actually advising us too, because he's an alumnus of UC San Diego, where Origami is based. That's also where I went to graduate school. So he's actually advising our work and playing this live action role-playing game. So we're going to be bringing in the students to create their own characters around this idea of Carver Farm, a future space to imagine what the Astro-Egalitarian Virtual Nation can look like. So here, we're also about creating characters. Nina created her own character that she calls, and I'm going to talk about it here, she calls herself a dream warrior, dream investigator, a dream warrior auntie who captures visions of the past and the future through ancestral conversations, utilizing brain-computer interface with brown eyes, brown skin, auntie warrior, and curly brown hair with long arms and legs, and wears blue skirts. She's an awakened communicator with the ancestors, seeking how and why. So this is part of creating her own avatar. And I think it's important because we can kind of reinvent our identities and imagine more with who we are through creating these avatars. And so it's important work that we did as part of a retreat, and what we're going to ask our students to do, to create their own avatars as well. So we actually had a convening of our Astro Virtual Egalitarian Network, Virtual Egalitarian Virtual Network, in San Francisco at the Long Now Foundation's bar called the Interval Bar. It was back in October 2022. And we're going to have a public-facing event in the coming year. But this is some of our network from the Black Speculative Arts movement that were part of this. And we'd like to invite more people to come and join us in discussing and outlining what this future could be. That's Ahmed Best. And we really talk a lot about signals of the future. And a signal is anything that, could be weird or interesting in music, art. In traditional futures forecasting, signals are like technology, what's happening that's trending in economics, environment, signals of climate change. They can be weak or strong signals, like artificial intelligence is a very strong signal right now of what's coming. But usually it's not led with art or looking at art or aesthetics as much. And also it's not led with people who have actually invented the future very vigorously. And that's us as Black people, right? Through music, art, technology, we invented so many things, like from Booker T. Washington, from Carver. We have I remember going into a museum room with my daughter one moment in this after-school program. It had thousands of images of Black inventors and scientists that we don't hear about, and that we are part of this legacy. So in essence, we are the signal. And we need to remind ourselves of that, remind our kids of that we are signals of the future. We have been constant innovators from the moment we arrived here as slaves. We weren't just slaves. We were reinventors of history. We shaped this nation. We founded this nation too. And that's what we have to remind ourselves of. So what are the basic outlines of the metaverse? Well, it's about our oral tradition. It's about tracking our digital record to get compensated for who we are through infrastructure tagging of our aesthetics, of our inventions. It's about infinite real estate. It's about creating our own currency. It's about framing the narrative. I was really inspired by hearing about how Eatonville blocked that acquisition of land, that sale, right, through storytelling. It was such a profound moment for me when I realized how storytelling played that role in it. It's about reclaiming our history to be able to create avatars that can be looked at and compensated. So Ahmed has this really great tale of Jar Jar Binks, because Jar Jar Binks, as a character, paved the way for the capturing of our bodies on the screen. He's not compensated for that, but the technology that was used with the imprint of his digital cells is now ubiquitous. So we use this analogy of Henrietta Lacks, whose biological cells were used without the permission of her and her family, but paved the way for curing diseases because they are immortal cells that keep reproducing themselves. So what if, we think about this oral tradition and we heal ourselves and we can create a Henrietta Lacks avatar that every time, I heal, a HeLa cell is being used and compensated for, right? To the family. Now, the task here is, who are you in the future? So how can you generate an image using, Midjourney, DALL-E, generate your own bio of who you are or who you want to be or who you aspire to be. Put that to an image. That's your avatar. You claim that. That's yours. Put it into the future. And this is what we teach our kids at the Community Future School. And then through Origami Year, we talk about where are you tools and when are you tools? Where are you? Where are you in a map of the future? I wanted to share this with you all because I just think it's so basic that we can do it right now. Where are you in this world? Like in an Eatonville, where are you located? Where you want to be located? What's your timeline? What year do you want to be from? That's where my shaman figure comes in 2045. So the Summit of the Future game, the live-action role-playing game, is taking place between the years 2033 and 2066. So I imagine myself as a holographic shaman in 2045, providing ancestral guidance and wisdom. And so these are basic tools that I think we can use to create not only our Astro-Egalitarian virtual nation and amplify our futures through Afrofuturism, but also feeding the Mothership AI with our own ancestral intelligence. Because what use is it to have artificial intelligence if it doesn't reflect our soul and is infused with our own ancestral intelligence? We have past visions of the future from Egypt and before that, and an amplification of that future through the Dagon that should infuse what AI is, what the Mothership AI is. So, this is our game. Our game is the algorithms from the futures game. So I decided to take 2 or 3 tensions and put them together. So we usually take 6 cards, and we choose 2. We usually do it through a vote. I'm going to be autocratic this time, and I've predetermined this for the sake of time and lack of, Wi-Fi. But so I've taken Black storytelling, which is so prominent and part of Edenville's history and future and present, and combined it with African innovation, which I kind of infused with AI, artificial intelligence. And so we come up with these 2 tensions. What does the world look like 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, or 30 years from now? You can pick a time where we have the most Black storytelling and the most African innovation. Usually in the game, we define these terms. What does Black storytelling mean to you? And maybe we could do that right now, real quickly. What does Black storytelling mean to you? I'm gonna flip it over to you right now. How would you define Black storytelling for yourselves? Maybe just couple of people. What does Black storytelling mean to you? Yes. An opportunity? Opportunity to craft an identity. I love that. To reclaim our history, an erasure of our history. Yes?
For me, it takes me back in time because I said, for me, it takes me back in time because Black storytelling for me is listening to my parents and their friends and relatives, laughing and sharing stories and talking about all kinds of things, just, it feels like home when I think of Black storytelling.
I love it. I love it. It reminds me of my dad telling me about how he used to make chili for his friends in high school, and he made them cry because his chili was so hot. It was so hot they would just cry. And I was like, Dad, I don't think I can eat your hot chili. And to this day, with spices, sometimes I'll tell my daughter when we're eating Mexican food, wow, this has a kick in it. And she's like, really? Are you sure about that? I'm like, yes. So, but yeah, thinking about my dad's chili, he passed away, but the idea of his vision, when I think about what he did, he wrote a book around how to smoke marijuana in the 70s. If he was in San Francisco right now, he'd laugh his ass off to look at the boutique and bougie dispensaries that are around in San Francisco, the Castro. I'm like, really? Wow. And then, he wrote a play about the Black experience in Vietnam, produced a play about the Black experience in Vietnam. He interviewed Amos and Andy for the LA Times. When I look back at him, he was an organizer, a seer, a librarian. He was a writer when he didn't finish his college education, coming from Kansas City, Missouri. He would tell me about how he was redlined and could not buy a home in Venice Beach or in LA. So these are his stories, right? So what I want to do for a minute to help build the Mothership AI that we have is pick a card, take Black superheroes, for instance, and combine it with city or skirt, and maybe the idea of work, and smash them together. And what artifact in the future would you come up with? Let's just do that for a minute. I know I'm putting you on the spot, but I had to play my game here. We have to play this game, to imagine, what Edenville might look like if you created an artifact from the future. So if you took, you could take designing food sustainability, mental health awareness, or Black superheroes, take combine that card, one of those cards with city or skirt, and combine it with work, smash them together. What artifact from the future might you come up with? Yeah. Oh, we got a few. Oh, okay.
Digital intergalactic compass. You need to have some tool to help you navigate all those different things.
All right, an intergalactic tool. Compass. Yes, I love it. A compass to navigate this universe. Yes, we need that, especially for AI. Yeah.
I think you would have a black female spirit doll that you can take with you to help heal and transform any negative energy anywhere you go. So that way, if you can take care of the negativity, then you can take care of the mental health. And it would be an avatar, black spirit doll.
Yes.
What, you know what it is, something.
Oh my
thing,
God.
Ephemera, I don't know.
Hey, you have that doll in your compass and you're good to go, right?
And it transports you everywhere you want to go and where to be. And whenever there's negative energy that triggers terrible kinds of mental, health feelings.
Yes.
You get the hell out quickly.
I love it. I love it. Yes, you wake up with this doll, It tells you things. It gives you energy. It gives you, pleasure, activism, right? Thank you. Anyone else? Well, think about it. We can come back to it, But that's kind of a sample of the game and how we could generate, even think about, how to create an Eatonville Museum of the future, too. So thinking about that, but kind of feeding these artifacts into the Mothership AI. What does that mean? What does that look like? So we can use Afro-rhythms to heal. We can use this game and other games like it. I don't pretend this is the be-all and end-all game like Meta or something. This is just one of the possibilities of games that can heal ourselves and heal others. And part of the Mothership AI experience. So we have applied for a National Endowment for Humanities grant to create an installation at the Museum of Children's Arts where you would go through and experience the Mothership tree and contribute an artifact from the future to it. And as you exit, you would see a vision of Oakland in 2045. So the idea through projections, through virtual reality, is to create this Mothership experience and make it real. And then this becomes the database to feed our Mothership AI. So for every algorithm of oppression, there's an Afro-rhythm of liberation. And I want to leave you with that today. Thank you. And you can also go to our site, afrorhythms.com, to see the game, to see who we are, what we're about, to join in on this conversation of creating the Mothership AI together. It's a collective conversation that we want to expand out to the world. And really, we are the signal. And remember that, please. We are the signal. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was great. Yeah, I was wondering about the, so you mentioned queer futurisms and stuff like that. So I'm just wondering, are you kind of like combining that concept and idea with the Afrofuturisms and Afro-rhythmic things, or is it kind of like, does it have, endpoints of its own that you're incorporating in the whole project itself?
Yeah, so I have a colleague, Jason Tester, a great white ally, Earthling, who's creating this vision of queer futurism, and inspired me about it, too. He's created a game around it as well. I also created a game around it, too. And the idea, we even wrote an article about it, queering Afrofuturism. So I'm queer as well, married. I was married once to a great Filipino woman, raised our daughter together, born in LA, what can I say, I'm California. Okay, so, So I think it's important to me to represent all of my identities, to have them coexist together simultaneously. That intersectionality is really important to me, and to know that LGBTQ people experience disproportionately the future signals like climate change. They experience these upheavals even more acutely. Growing old, what does that mean? How do you avoid the loneliness of that experience as in being queer as well? And so this idea that, we might have robots to assist us in our elderly growth, as we age, how can we make sure that they're not biased? So it's also about using the algorithm to heal and eradicate bias that's disproportionately about, white supremacy. As Ibram Kendi talks about, white supremacy is a conversation that was invented 500 years ago. So we can have fun dismantling it. We can have fun eradicating it. We can have joy in ending white supremacy. And so that's part of what queer futurism is about too. And also, there's white supremacy in queer culture. Right? It's like, how do you eradicate that? So it's really important to have that represented as its own thing, but also as it intersects with Afrofuturism too. So. And indigenous futurism as well. So there's Walking on the Clouds, a great book by Grace, I'm forgetting her first name, but it's about science fiction stories of indigenous futurism, how the indigenous and land back is so important to them too, and how they envision the future of their own tribes. Yeah, thank you. It's a great question.
Hi, nice to meet you, Doctor. I'm Savon. I'm an artist, I'm a writer, and I feel like as a young person, I haven't always had the most representation when it comes to Afrofuturist works, like plays and movies and TV. I don't really see me too often. But I know, like everything else when it comes to Black art, like there's so many Black artists and writers and creators that go under the radar. So I was wondering if you knew of any Afrofuturist works that you could recommend to me that aren't known to the common public.
Well, yeah, there is Afrofuturism 2.0, the rise of Astro Blackness. It's more scholarly, but there's also Ytasha Womack, whose work is very accessible about Afrofuturism. But there's also Kujo Soon, whose basic article around Afrofuturism is so inspiring because he has these little snippets of Afrofuturist archaeologists in the future that are talking about Afrofuturism from the future. And it's this wonderful journey and introduction to Afrofuturism that I love. But now, with Megascope as a comic imprint from John Jennings, this wonderful stream of comics is coming out. So, and you heard Ibram Kendi talking about that he's getting a story about Eatonville, but look at Megascope, and it's a wonderful imprint of these graphic novels that are coming out right now. I'm hoping Mothership Comics is part of that imprint too. We'll talk. I'm gonna have some conversations with John Jennings, so we'll see. But I'm gonna, so that is part of it. There's just these wonderful, Name Brown on Instagram. Look at his art. Name Brown, N-Y-A-M-E, Brown. He is a fantastic artist. He just inspires me daily with his work. Also, Natrice Gaskins wrote a book around the vernacular of Black aesthetics. And she is amazing, So following her on Instagram and her work is really inspiring. But yeah, and there's wonderful works of queer futurism and indigenous futurism, great art there. So looking that up, you'll find a lot of links, or many links, not a lot yet, but they're emerging. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and please, you are the signal. Because, that's another thing. I grew up in the 70s, right? Surrounded by great science fiction ideas. But they didn't represent me. Maybe Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek was the only one, and then Lieutenant Forge in Next Generation. That's like a gap of 20 years between those series. Seriously. And then there was Sun Ra and some of his films. But, man, And I was like determined that when I was asked by Ronaldo Anderson, the co-founder of the Black Speculative Arts Movement, to sponsor or to help produce a conference around Black Speculative Arts Movement in Oakland, I became connected with different artists in this network and theorists, and I was determined to create an ecosystem that represented and brought the future to us, so that every child, like Ibram Kendi is doing too, is surrounded by this ecosystem, imagining the future for themselves. Because I felt so like a Black nerd, marginalized at the end. I didn't know who, was anyone like that? Who else was like me? So that was so important to create this new ecology. Thank you. And you're part of it. Yeah. Now I'm ramped up. Any questions? Come on. Oh, wow. Okay, yeah.
So, great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I was wondering about when you mentioned the ability of the brain to envision the future, and if you were equating that to the more recent psychological arguments that hope is what counteracts the previous argument of learned helplessness that happens when either from disability or in the case of slavery, that sort of thing. That was the argument, like that once you learn that, it's very hard to get a new mindset.
Yeah. So I was, I got it all. I was born with a visual impairment, very nearsighted because my lenses were detached from my eyes a bit. So I got it fixed like 10 or 15 years ago, took out my lenses, put in plastic lenses. Woo, saw my daughter again. But the idea is that how do you see yourself in a different history, an alternative vision of yourself? So the hope, idea of positive psychology, it's really, how do you create a new story for yourself and have agency in that and give yourself agency? And that's where storytelling became so profound to me, where computing became profound for me because it became a new way of seeing. And so that's really important to me in terms of looking at disability and looking at hope. So yeah, thank you. Great question. And one more, okay. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Brooks. Sure. I'm an architect, and I have probably a bad obsession with modeling digital buildings and cities. So forgive the question, but how did you create the image of the city? What informs its physical presence?
Well, Origami Air, they have great programmers, first of all, great graphic designers and programmers, a team of 2 women. Trisha is one of them. So they actually, what they did was they had a group of people in the UC San Diego community as a cohort and voted each step of the way of what that town would look like. I was part of one of those votes. And they took it in virtual reality. So we kind of lined up and decided, which path to go on in terms of a particular vision of what that town would look like. It was very important that it be a liberating fit, that it was based on this tale that there was this old fishing village, and then it became something else. So that's how they informed their design choices, was through collaboration with other people and a variety of other people. But they use the basic tools of Unity and other forms and their own aesthetics too. So they welcomed me in and others to kind of help shape that aesthetics from a different perspective, from Afrofuturism as well. So that's basic. I'm not a complete programmer at all, but I do science technology studies. So that's what I can give you, but I'm happy to connect you to them for more information as well. Yeah. Thanks. Oh.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I think my brain grew 2 more sizes just from like a third of what you were saying. You had mentioned earlier, like, mentioning a certain individual from Facebook and how like colonialism is kind of occupying a lot of our digital spaces. So especially with Afro rhythms, how do you see that combating, challenging, and making new space for folks, especially because so much, whether we're talking about AI artists, like kind of co-opting a lot of other artists' works, or folks that are coming in and taking people's data. How do you see Afro rhythms as a space where people can like reclaim some of that agency and be in community with each other? Thank you.
Oh, I love that question. You know, there's a good talk I saw a few years ago about 500 seeds being spread during the Anthropocene. And the idea is that we're creating seeds of the future through these artifacts that people are creating and collaboratively creating with among organizations. We played this game over maybe 1,000 times now with at least 40 different organizations, including Google. So Google is not a monolith, like any organization is not a monolith. There's a big faction in Google that is trying to promote more liberating conversations around race, around ethnicity, around being liberatory. And so, you know, I don't know how much of a dent we're making, but that's the part of it, is like dismantling white supremacy one seed at a time, one artifact from the future at a time. So we're creating an archive of these images as well. And I think, you know, we've played with, you know, I played this in my school, played at the Museum of Children's Arts. We play it with different universities and organizations. We played it with US Bank, and their theme was about queer futures. I was like, whoa, I did not expect US Bank to talk about that, you know? But, so we play with Afro Comic Con. We play with the Museum of Children, the Oakland Museum in Oakland. We're gonna play this game with the University of Kansas at Lawrence, too. So it's about spreading these seeds that we are signals of the future and that we can create these artifacts. The people have agency in the future. I think that's the whole point, is that we kind of give up our agency because of the inevitability with which these technologies are framed. AI is coming, so there's nothing you can do about it. You know, it's like, that's kind of how the conversation is framed, where it's actually, no, it's an opportunity to reclaim it as our own, through our own. That's why creating your own avatar is so important. Creating your own artifact of the future and collaborating with people to actually create it. You can make these things, you know, form a team together, you know, programmer, policymaker, people on the ground. You can create these things, just like Edenville has reshaping itself in its own image. Now it can reshape itself in the digital future as well. So I think that's really important to understand. You know, how would Edenville look like in virtual reality? You know, how to imagine it. So, yeah, one seed at a time. Thank you. And especially in these dark times where, you know, we don't know who's going to be our president, it's especially important.
Yeah. So, the AI and Afrofuturism is certainly a tool. We're looking toward the future. Even if you look at the past, you're looking at what could have been. Would you say that it is strictly a tool to be used for those populations that have been marginalized? Because you mentioned LGBTQ, you mentioned a flight away from white supremacy and its influence. Is it just for marginalized communities or any community that sees a path for opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say any community that sees a path for opportunity for sure. And it's one of these things where, like I was just reading about deep fakes, you know, and where seeing will not always be about believing, but how we can, you know, with the whole Taylor Swift thing that just happened, you know, where deep fakes of her image were spread around virally. The idea that we can create these deep fakes, but that they can be authenticated as being false or not through blockchain technology is going to be really important. The other thing is that they can be used to recreate people, our ancestors, our folks who have passed on. We can recreate their wisdom through deep fakes as well. And Educationally, deepfakes can be used to recreate experiences of the past that inform our future as well. You know, imagine seeing MLK's speech or others too, Eatonville ancestors, and imagining engaging them in conversation with you. So deepfake technology can be both about helping other communities in various aspects, right? It could be in virtually any community. Again, you know, we're going to be facing the challenges of, you know, the evil too, right? The far right using it as well. So we have to prepare ourselves and buttress ourselves with our own agency over these technologies too. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Sure. So a deep fake is, so with AI, you can recreate someone's saying something and they may not have ever said it. You can be, recently a deep fake of Obama circulated, putting words into his mouth that he had never said. So a deep fake image of like Taylor Swift doing something or enacting something will be more commonplace. You know, the idea that you can now generate and ask GPT-4 questions about things will now occur, or is occurring in images and in videos. And this is the worst that the technology is at the moment and will ever be. It's only going to get better. So, you know, by the end of the year, you'll be able to generate images and videos. I just saw this thing happening at YouTube right now. I know a director of AI at YouTube who they've gotten together a group of musicians like John Legend, for example, or some other ones. And you can say, oh, you know, play a song around swimming in the pool, being happy and being liberated. And he'll sing it for you through this technology. It'll become a song. AI can create a song that will sound like him, having your lyrics. So that's an image, that's an example of another kind of, well, you know, deep fake, but also, you know, part of imagining an expression of yourself through someone else's music. So again, how do we use this technology to our benefit? And how do we navigate our children through understanding what these deep fakes are and are not? How they can be used and leveraged for reclaiming ourselves and centering ourselves as signals of the future. So yeah, thank you. That's a great question.
So I have a question as an educator.
Yeah.
And I only learned really about AI and its power maybe last year and saw people using it all the time. And, oh, I just used my post. I just created an AI post. And I was really offended. And I think a friend of mine created an AI book because it was basically content that they took and repackaged into a book. And so, and then also coming to, I teach at the University of Maryland, students have submitted papers that were generated through AI, and I know it because it's vague, it's unsighted, and there are other people's ideas with nobody giving credit to it. So as a colleague, how do you, before I ask the question, let me say I love the presentation, because before this, I'm like, I don't know what Afrofuturism is. They say everything's Afrofuturism, but this was a gorgeous presentation. So I love all of my notes, and I love the presentation.
Thank you.
But what is your perspective on students submitting AI-generated papers? Like, how do you deal with that? And, you know, because I'm like, right now, I'm kind of like very conservative. I'm like, nah, that shit is plagiarism. But then everybody so I don't know. So, excuse my language. But I want to know your perspective so I can be more informed and enlightened and not so reactionary in terms of thinking about AI use and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you know, I mean, AI doesn't, you know, to really use AI, it helps to be an expert in your field, you know, and so if you take students, walk them through it, you could say, well, okay, talk about, first generate a draft, and then put it through the ChatGPT and see what it does with it. Does it improve it? What is it missing? So you critique it, you know, have it be more of a co-pilot than just a complete blank author of your work. And also, there are tools that detect AI use right now, but they're not, you know, they're hit or miss. But I think I would walk them through a critical analysis of how you use it with care, because it's going to make up citations, and you have to follow those citations and make sure they're real. It'll make up things because it's programmed to give you an answer. It's a pattern detection device more than anything at the moment. So it's going to come up with fake citations. And so you have your students see, well, are those citations real? You know? Yeah.
Add to that, I also teach university in humanities, and we now have, the past 10 years, plagiarism was emerging, and we had a Turnitin.com registry there. But now, as of this past year, I now have a second AI indicator. So I'm looking at and so there's a percentage there of whether the citations are AI generated. That was the first piece, and now they've perfected it so we can see if the paper, because there's patterns. You can tell when the AI has generated this paper. So I guess the universities are going to have to start adopting it, and as they become more comfortable with that percentage pattern, so they have these detections.
But what I'm hearing, are you saying that we should encourage them to use it ethically?
Yeah, I think so.
As opposed to be like, no, because I can tell this is AI because I know how it looks and sounds because I put the same terms in there and this is what it spit out. So,
I tend to say, they're probably going to use it in some manner. So teach them how to use it more carefully, more intentionally, and I'd say kind of embracing it to leverage it, and so, how do you use it intelligently? I have colleagues of mine that say they're using it to generate terms around experiences they've had too. And so there's an intelligent way to use this, just like Wikipedia, right? You cite Wikipedia, you can cite that you've used AI. There's actually we work with a librarian who's a digital archivist for Afterville, and she told me a way that you cite your use of AI too. I can share that with you as well. But that's an important piece. How do you cite that you've actually used AI in the creation of a work, with care? And I think that's going to be more important. And also, the AI technologists have to get on the program for meta tagging the use of other people's work too, right? There's an ongoing lawsuit against by the New York Times or other newspapers against the use of AI. Against the citation of AI work, because it's drawing on a global database or databases, that is. Yeah, thank you. That's such an important question, and so we really have to tackle it. Yeah.
I guess mine is similar, tagging on to what they all said. I also have been an educator since 2011, and so with all the evolution or de-evolution of technology, you have to learn to adapt. Because I was like you at the beginning, the college didn't really support anything other than, well, make sure they don't plagiarize, figure out a way. So I had taught K through 8 as well before, so I went back in time, kind of with your same thing, and I used the stamp method and would edit all their stuff in class. And then I was like, okay, now you can't add anything except quotes that we've talked about in class. And so then nothing could be plagiarized. Well, then of course it evolved more. And then what you said, the next semester they added on that little thing, but then the college was like, well, we're not legally able to do anything, even if you find this percentage of whatever the trend thing is now. So you said, and several other people, another friend at HBCU, we also, as white women, didn't want to persecute or do anything further to hurt students who are already from that background and why the HBCU exists in the first place. So we also were like, okay, we're going to bring ChatGPT literally in the classroom, show them, even the ones that don't know it, what it is, and like you said, utilize it. And even now, I started utilizing it in my own notes. I was so against it before. And as an English professor or instructor, you're always, oh, plagiarism is horrific. But it's not just for plagiarism. Like you said, it's so many evolving things that it can be used for. So just teaching them how to use it ethically, I think, is how we have to do it now. Because there's no way around them not using it.
Yeah, it's how do you use it? How do you talk about how it borrows from other folks' work too, and how to understand. I think we need to raise the level of AI literacy in general. I think that's important. Yeah, without fear and more understanding, So it is going to be like a second self. It's going to be our companion in a sense. So how do we understand it and what it is, what it can't do, its limits, Very important to know its limits. So, yeah, thank you. So I was really, really scared because Ibram Kendi was talking before me. I was like, how in the hell am I going to follow that up? But he left enough room to talk about the future as he's making it himself. So thank you all. Really appreciate that.
That is the closing session for our fifth and final Afrofuturism conference. And I really want to give out a shout out to Julian Chambliss, who literally imagined this into existence. I was there at the National Planners meeting, I think it was in 2019, where you laid it all out. Although it was really just like 5 titles. Yeah. And then he filled them in as the years went by. So here you go.
Yes, I want to thank Scott for all of his work and UCF, who has been a very important partner. Obviously, our focus on Afrofuturism seemed a little weird when we started, but now seems super normal, hopefully, for people. The cycle for next year or the next cycle is placemaking. So hopefully our conversation around space will set the pathway for the placemaking conversation. I don't know what's going to happen because I ain't responsible. But I always want to thank the many volunteers that allow for us to do this work every year. The same people show up every year to make it happen, both in terms of the festival and in terms of academics. People like Trent, who always holds down and fills in the gaps, and we really appreciate that. So, yes, thank you to our last speaker. Thanks for all the speakers who appeared these many years as we've been doing this program. And thank you for your willingness to sort of play along with us as we explain Afrofuturism so many different ways. Always important to recognize one of our goals with this project was to document it well. So if you missed a year, you can always go and find information about the talks and the people and some of the ideas they offered through STARS, which is the UCF Digital Repository. So you can sort of follow along, and they'll be the same with this year. We'll get everything available for folks. So thanks a lot, and go have fun.